The darkness speaks first, always, before the first cry pierces the birth canal, before consciousness learns to name itself. There exists this primordial conversation, a dialect older than words, more intimate than breath itself. You emerged from the womb already fluent in this ancient tongue, though it would take decades to understand that your native language was not the harsh consonants of the surface world, but the liquid vowels of the deep. In the beginning, there was silence, not the hollow emptiness that makes the shallow dwellers panic and reach for their devices, their distractions, their desperate noise-making. No, this was the pregnant darkness that holds all possibility within its vast belly, the cosmic womb space where stars are conceived and souls choose their earthly vessels. You knew this silence before you knew your mother's face, recognized its voice before you learned your own name. The child you intuited what the adult world had forgotten. That silence is not the absence of communication, but its most profound form. In the spaces between your mother's lullabies, in the pause before your father's goodnight kiss, in the held breath of the house settling into sleep, you discovered a language richer than any dictionary could contain. Your first words may have been mama or dada, but your first real conversation was with the darkness itself, that patient teacher who spoke in dreams and shadows, in the movement of curtains when no wind stirred, in the quality of light that shifts just before understanding arrives. Others noticed early that you were different, though they lacked the vocabulary to name what they sensed. Teachers called you thoughtful or introspective when they felt charitable, withdrawn, or difficult when their patience wore thin. Playground companions found you strange, the way you would pause mid-game, staring at something they couldn't see, listening to sounds they couldn't hear. You learned to apologize for your depth before you even understood what you were apologizing for. But in the secret sanctuary of your inner world, you were becoming fluent in the dialect of shadows. Every fairy tale whispered something your daylight mind couldn't quite grasp. Every nursery rhyme contained coded messages about transformation and death, about the necessary cruelty that precedes all rebirth. While other children skipped over the dark verses, you lingered there, sensing that these were the most important parts, the places where the story revealed its true face beneath the mask of innocence. The shadows taught you their first lesson through play. Hide and seek became a spiritual practice, though you didn't have words for it then. In the darkness beneath the stairs, in the cave space under blankets, in the hollow of the old oak tree, you discovered that hiding wasn't about escape. It was about encounter. With what? You couldn't say. But something met you in those dark places, something that recognized you as kin, that spoke your name in a voice like wind through autumn leaves. Your parents worried. They took you to doctors who shone lights in your eyes and asked questions that had no real answers. Why does she stare like that? Is it normal for a child to be so quiet? Should we be concerned about her imagination? The medical professionals found nothing wrong with your body, but they couldn't examine your soul with their instruments. They couldn't measure the depth of your inner ocean, or chart the territories you were already exploring in your sleep. School became your first real initiation into the alien language of the surface world. Here, the shadows that had been your companions were banished by fluorescent lights. The silence that had nurtured you was replaced by constant chatter, by the teacher's voice explaining things you already understood through different channels. You learned to translate, to take the wisdom the darkness had whispered and reshape it into acceptable answers for pop quizzes and book reports. But translation is always a form of betrayal. Something essential was lost each time you tried to explain how you knew what you knew. The knowing itself became suspect when you couldn't produce the proper citations, when you couldn't show your work the way math problems demanded. Your intuitive understanding of character motivations in stories, your uncanny ability to sense when someone was lying, your profound empathy for the villains who everyone else dismissed. These gifts had no place in the standardized curriculum of childhood. The other children sensed your difference like animals, sensed storms coming, Some were drawn to you with the fascination that the shallow feel for depth. They wanted to peer into your waters but feared falling in. Others maintained careful distance, instinctively understanding that proximity to your intensity might awaken something in themselves they weren't ready to meet. A few became fast friends, those rare souls who shared your native tongue, who could sit with you in comfortable silence and know that real conversation was happening in the spaces between words. Your sensitivity became both gift and burden. You absorbed the emotions of everyone around you like a psychic sponge, soaking up feelings that weren't your own, until you couldn't distinguish between your inner weather and the atmospheric pressure of the collective unconscious. Walking through crowds felt like being pelleted by invisible stones, each person's unexpressed pain, their hidden joy, their secret shame bombarding your porous boundaries until you learned to build walls just to survive. But the shadows taught you their second lesson. Every wall that keeps pain out also keeps wisdom in. The very sensitivity that overwhelmed you was also your greatest teacher through your permeable boundaries. You learned the fundamental truth that Jung would later articulate, that the individual psyche is not separate from the collective soul, that we are all threads in a vast tapestry of shared consciousness, each of us carrying not only our personal wounds, but the inherited trauma and wisdom of the species. Your family dinners became lessons in diplomatic translation. Around the table, surface conversations flowed about weather and work, school and schedules, while underneath, the real conversations pulsed with everything that couldn't be spoken directly. You heard it all. The marriage tensions disguised as discussions about money, the existential crises masked as complaints about the boss, the deep loneliness that everyone carried but no one named. Your attempts to address these deeper currents were met with uncomfortable laughter, quick subject changes, the subtle but clear message that good children don't mention what adults pretend not to feel. So you learned to keep two sets of books: the surface ledger where you recorded the acceptable version of events, and the shadow ledger where you tracked the real transactions of the heart. This double bookkeeping became second nature, though it left you feeling like a spy in your own life, like an anthropologist studying the strange customs of a tribe you could never fully join. The dialect of shadows revealed its third teaching through your dreams. Night after night, your sleeping mind dove deeper than your waking consciousness dared to go. You dreamed in symbols and metaphors, in colors that had no names and emotions that had no earthly equivalent. These weren't the random firings of neural networks that your science teachers would later claim, but carefully crafted lessons in the curriculum of the unconscious. A recurring dream. You are standing at the edge of a vast forest where the trees grow so thick that daylight never touches the ground. Everyone else at the forest's edge turns away, choosing the bright path that leads back to town. But you step forward into the darkness, and as your eyes adjust, you see that the forest floor is carpeted with stars. Each step deeper into the shadow realm reveals more wonders: flowers that bloom only in darkness, springs that bubble with liquid moonlight, creatures that exist nowhere in the daylight world, but are more real than anything you've touched with your waking hands. You wake from such dreams with tears on your cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of recognition. These are your true country's landscapes. This is where your soul feels most at home, not in the harsh clarity of noon, but in the mysterious twilight, where all possibilities exist simultaneously, where the known and unknown dance together in eternal embrace. The shadow's fourth lesson came through your relationship with books. While other children were satisfied with stories that ended with happily ever after, you were drawn to the tales that acknowledged the complexity of existence, myths where heroes failed, fairy tales where transformation required sacrifice, legends where wisdom could only be earned through descent into the underworld. You read voraciously, not just consuming stories, but being consumed by them, allowing them to reshape your inner landscape with each turning page. Literature became your first formal introduction to the language you'd been speaking all your life. In poetry, you found words that approximated the inner experience you'd never been able to explain. In mythology, you discovered that your strange dreams and deep knowings were part of humanity's oldest traditions. In the works of mystics and philosophers, you encountered other souls who had learned the dialect of shadows, who could articulate the ineffable truths you'd been carrying wordlessly in your bones. Your teachers began to notice your unusual relationship with language. Your essays went deeper than the assignments required. Your analysis uncovered layers of meaning that surprised even your instructors. But this gift came with its own isolation. Your classmates' eyes would glaze over when you shared your insights, and you learned to self-censor, to offer only the surface interpretations that wouldn't make others uncomfortable with the depth of their own ignorance. The fifth teaching of the shadows emerged through your relationship with time itself. While the surface world rushed forward in linear progression, schedules and deadlines, cause and effect, past and future, you experienced time as the ancients did, as a spiral where all moments exist simultaneously. Past wounds bled into present moments. Future possibilities cast their shadows backward. The eternal now opened like a flower in your chest, revealing that all seeking was remembering, all growth was return. This temporal fluency made you seem absent-minded to those who lived only in clock time. You would miss appointments not from carelessness, but because you had slipped into the eternal present where minutes meant nothing. You would arrive at conversations already deep in thoughts that had been germinating for months, forgetting that others needed the context of linear progression to follow your meaning. Your adolescence intensified everything. The dialect of shadows became a flood that threatened to sweep away whatever fragile bridges you'd built to the surface world. Hormones didn't just change your body, they activated dormant psychic channels, opened you to levels of sensitivity that were almost unbearable. You felt everything, the collective anxiety of your generation, the suppressed dreams of your parents, the historical trauma embedded in the very architecture of your school building. Depression became your teacher, though it would be years before you understood its lessons. What others saw as illness, what you experienced as drowning, was actually initiation, the necessary descent that every deep soul must make to touch the bedrock of their being. In the darkness of those months or years, you learned that the shadows you'd been conversing with since childhood weren't separate from you. They were you, the disowned parts of yourself that demanded integration. The dialect of shadows revealed its deepest secret. There is no conversation with darkness that doesn't transform the speaker. Every word exchanged in that liminal language changes the very fabric of your being. You cannot commune with the unconscious and remain unchanged. You cannot listen to the wisdom of the wounded parts without becoming both healer and patient, teacher and student, seeker and sought. Your family's well-meaning attempts to cheer you up or look on the bright side felt like violence. They were asking you to abandon the very journey your soul had undertaken, to turn away from the threshold you'd finally found the courage to cross. Their optimism was a luxury you could no longer afford, not because you'd become pessimistic, but because you'd discovered that real hope could only be born from authentic encounter with despair. Recovery, when it came, wasn't a return to who you'd been before. It was an integration of who you'd always been with who you were becoming. The shadows hadn't been conquered or banished. They'd been welcomed home, given their rightful place in the parliament of the psyche. You learned to speak their language not just in crisis but in daily life, to honor their wisdom alongside the sunshine certainties of the ego. The surface world noticed the change. You carried yourself differently now, with the quiet authority of one who has been to the underworld and returned with gifts. Your words carried more weight because they emerged from deeper soil. Your silences were more profound because they were full of understanding rather than empty of knowing. You'd learned that the dialect of shadows wasn't a second language. It was your mother tongue, the first voice that had ever truly spoken your name. The shadows' final teaching, the one that would take a lifetime to fully understand, came in the form of recognition. Every person you would ever meet was also a native speaker of this ancient dialect, whether they remembered it or not. The businessman rushing past on the street carried the same primordial darkness in his briefcase. The soccer mum honking her horn in traffic was fleeing the same profound silence that had once frightened her. The teacher, the doctor, the barista, the stranger on the bus, all of them had once known this language, had once been fluent in the conversation between light and shadow that births all meaning. Your calling began to crystallize. You would become a translator between worlds, not to drag others down into darkness, but to help them remember that the depth they feared was actually the source of their greatest power. You would learn to speak surface languages well enough to earn trust, but you would never forget that real healing, real growth, real love could only happen when people remembered how to converse with their own shadows. The child who had once hidden under blankets to hear the whispers of the unconscious had grown into an adult who could midwife others' encounters with their own depth. The silence that had been your first teacher remained your most faithful companion, but now you understood its true nature, not absence, but presence, not void, but fullness, not ending, but eternal beginning. In the dialect of shadows, every ending is a doorway, every wound is a window, every descent is the beginning of ascent. You learn to speak this truth, not with words alone, but with your entire being, becoming a living testimony to the transformative power of befriending the darkness. The conversation that began in your mother's womb continued in every interaction, every relationship, every moment when you chose depth over surface, truth over comfort, integration over denial. The shadows had taught you their ultimate secret. They were never separate from the light. They were the light's deepest expression, the creative darkness from which all illumination emerges. In learning their dialect, you hadn't become fluent in a foreign language. You'd remembered how to speak the mother tongue of the universe itself, the first word that created all worlds, the eternal conversation between conscious and unconscious. That is the heartbeat of existence itself. The map was never drawn on paper. It lived in the chambers of your heart, inked in the blood of experiences too profound for ordinary cartography. While others navigated by the well-worn paths of conventional emotion, the broad highways of happiness and sadness, the familiar streets of anger and fear, you discovered territories that existed beyond the borders of any emotional atlas the surface world had ever charted. Your compass pointed not north toward magnetic certainty, but inward toward the pull of authentic experience. This inner magnetism drew you through landscapes of feeling that others couldn't even see, let alone understand. What they mistook for moodiness was actually your careful attention to the subtle shifts in emotional weather. What they called complexity was your natural fluency in the nuanced dialects of the heart's hidden kingdoms. The first territory you mapped was the land of unspoken knowing. Here, conversations happened in the spaces between words, in the quality of silence that followed a question, in the way someone's eyes changed when they touched upon their deepest truth. You learned early that the most important communications never made it to the surface of speech. They traveled through subtler channels, through the electromagnetic field of presence, through the way energy shifted when truth was spoken or avoided, through the invisible threads that connected one heart to another beneath the level of conscious awareness. In this territory, you developed your first navigation tools. You learned to read the micro-expressions that flickered across faces like weather patterns across sky, a barely perceptible tightening around the eyes that signaled hidden pain, the microscopic pause before someone said, "I'm fine," that revealed they were anything but, the way people's voices changed pitch when they spoke about the subjects closest to their core wounds or deepest dreams. Others found your attention unsettling. Teachers accused you of staring. Classmates called you weird for asking follow-up questions about things they'd barely mentioned. Your parents worried about your intensity, the way you seemed to see through their carefully constructed facades to the raw humanity underneath. But you weren't trying to be invasive. You were simply reading the emotional landscape with the same natural ability that others used to read street signs. The second territory on your inner map was the realm of borrowed feelings. Here you discovered that your heart had no clear boundaries, that emotions flowed through you like rivers through a delta, carrying the sediment of everyone else's unexpressed experiences. You would walk into a room and immediately know who was grieving, who was excited, who was hiding anger behind a smile. Their feelings became your feelings, not through conscious choice, but through the permeable membrane of your empathic nature. This realm was both blessing and curse. It granted you extraordinary understanding of others. You could sense what they needed before they knew it themselves, could offer comfort that seemed telepathically precise. But it also meant carrying the weight of collective emotion, absorbing pain that wasn't yours to heal, taking responsibility for atmospheric shifts in the emotional weather that others created but couldn't feel. You learned to map this territory through trial and error, developing techniques that wouldn't be named for years: energy hygiene, psychic boundaries, the art of compassionate detachment. You discovered that certain places had emotional histories embedded in their very walls, that some people were emotional broadcasters who transmitted their inner states with radio tower intensity, that your sensitivity was both gift and responsibility, requiring careful stewardship. The third territory you charted was the valley of mistranslated moments. Here lived all the times when your depth was misread as distance, your thoughtfulness labeled as aloofness, your need for processing time interpreted as lack of caring. This valley was crowded with misunderstandings, with relationships strained by the failure of translation between your internal language and the surface world's expectations. In this valley, you learned that being a deep soul in a shallow world meant constantly explaining yourself and rarely being understood even after explanation. Your careful listening, which came from genuine desire to understand, was read as judgment. Your thoughtful pauses, which allowed wisdom to emerge from silence, were mistaken for disconnection. Your tendency to respond to the deeper currents beneath surface conversations was seen as inappropriate intensity or social awkwardness. The map-making here required a different kind of courage, the willingness to be misunderstood while remaining true to your authentic way of being. You learned to translate not by diminishing your depth, but by finding bridges between worlds. You developed skills in speaking multiple emotional languages: the surface dialect for daily interactions, the middle language for those ready for more depth, and the full depth language reserved for the rare souls who could meet you in your natural habitat. Your fourth territory was the desert of existential thirst. This vast expanse appeared during those moments when the questions that drove you, why are we here? What does it mean to live authentically? How do we love in the face of impermanence? Met the surface world's impatience with such inquiries. Here, you wandered through conversations that satisfied others, but left you parched for meaning, through social interactions that filled time but starved the soul. In this desert, you learned to carry your own water, to find nourishment in books and art, in solitary contemplation and communion with nature, in the few relationships that could sustain the kind of conversation your soul required. You discovered that existential thirst wasn't a problem to be solved, but a compass pointing toward what mattered most. The very intensity of your longing for meaning was itself meaningful, a sign that you carried something precious that demanded authentic expression. The mapping of this territory taught you discernment, how to recognize which conversations were worth your emotional investment, which relationships could hold the full spectrum of your being, which environments nourished your particular way of engaging with existence. You learned that it was better to have a few profound connections than many shallow ones, better to speak truthfully to empty rooms than falsely to full ones. The fifth territory on your emotional map was the ocean of uncharted intimacy. Here you discovered that your capacity for connection ran deeper than the conventional understanding of closeness. While others were content with sharing facts and opinions, activities and interests, you found yourself naturally diving toward the more profound currents, the fears and dreams, the wounds and wonders, the questions that kept people awake at night, and the experiences that had shaped their souls. This oceanic depth of intimacy both attracted and terrified others. Some were drawn to the prospect of being truly known, of finding someone who could see past their personas to their authentic selves. Others fled from such depth, sensing that proximity to your way of loving would demand a level of vulnerability they weren't prepared to offer. You learned that not everyone wanted to be seen as deeply as you naturally saw them, that your gift for intimacy required careful calibration to honor others' boundaries while remaining true to your nature. In this ocean, you developed new navigation skills, learning to read the currents of someone's readiness for depth, understanding when to dive deeper and when to surface for air, recognizing the difference between those who feared intimacy and those who simply needed time to develop their own capacity for it. You discovered that your gift wasn't just seeing deeply but creating safe harbor for others to explore their own depths. The sixth territory emerged as you matured, the highlands of paradoxical feeling. Here lived all the emotions that didn't fit into the simple categories the world preferred. The grief that carried gratitude, the anger that was actually love in fierce disguise, the loneliness that connected you to all other lonely hearts across time and space, the joy that broke your heart with its terrible beauty. This territory required the most sophisticated mapping tools, an ability to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them, to embrace the both and rather than demanding either. Here you learned that the human heart is large enough to contain multitudes, that emotional maturity means developing comfort with complexity rather than seeking the false comfort of oversimplification. Your relationships deepened when you could share this map with others, when you could give them permission to feel more than one thing at a time, to experience the full spectrum of human emotion without judgment. You became a kind of emotional cartographer for others, helping them navigate territories of their own hearts they hadn't known existed. The seventh territory you discovered was the borderlands of sacred sensitivity. This liminal space existed at the edges of all other emotional territories, the places where feeling becomes knowing, where intuition emerges from the marriage of heart and mind, where your sensitivity revealed itself not as weakness, but as a highly sophisticated system for reading the subtle energies that govern human interaction. In these borderlands, you learned that your emotional intensity wasn't something to be managed or diminished, but a powerful tool for navigating the complexity of human existence. Your ability to feel deeply allowed you to understand motivations that others missed, to sense the currents beneath surface behaviors, to offer precisely the kind of presence that situations required. Here you discovered that what others called too sensitive was actually sensitive enough to detect the early warning signs of relationship dysfunction, sensitive enough to feel the collective emotional weather and respond accordingly, sensitive enough to know when someone needed comfort before they asked for it, challenge before they were ready to receive it, or simply the gift of being witnessed in their struggle. The mapping of this territory required developing a new relationship with your sensitivity, seeing it not as a burden to be borne, but as a gift to be stewarded. You learned to honor your empathic nature without being overwhelmed by it, to use your emotional intelligence in service of healing and growth, rather than allowing it to drain your vital energy. Your eighth territory was the mountain range of transformative conversation. These peaks rose wherever you encountered someone else who spoke your native language of depth, who could meet you in the rarefied air of authentic exchange. Here, words became vehicles for transmission rather than mere information transfer. Conversations became ceremonies, dialogues transformed into communions of understanding. In these mountains, you learned that your gift for depth wasn't meant to be hidden or diluted, but shared with those who could receive it. You discovered that there were others who had been drawing their own maps of uncharted emotional territories, who had developed their own navigation tools for exploring the depths of human experience. The loneliness of being misunderstood gave way to the profound relief of being recognized. These peak experiences taught you to trust your instincts about who could join you in the thin air of deep conversation, who had developed the emotional lung capacity for such altitudes. You learned to recognize fellow travelers not by their words alone, but by their quality of presence, their willingness to linger in complexity rather than rushing toward resolution, their comfort with the kind of silence that gestates wisdom. The ninth territory on your map was the caverns of inherited feeling. Deep underground, you discovered emotions that weren't originally yours, the ancestral pain passed down through generations, the collective trauma embedded in your cultural DNA, the unexpressed dreams and disappointments of those who came before you. This territory required archaeological tools, the ability to excavate feelings that had been buried for decades or centuries. Here you learned that your emotional landscape was vast, not just in width and depth, but in time, extending backward to encompass the emotional legacy of your lineage and forward toward the feelings of future generations who would inherit whatever you chose to heal or leave unresolved. Your sensitivity became a form of service, allowing you to feel and process emotions that others in your family line had been unable to face. The mapping of these caverns taught you about the responsibility that comes with emotional depth, the understanding that your willingness to feel fully wasn't just personal healing but collective medicine, that your commitment to processing pain rather than passing it on was a gift to the entire web of relationships you inhabited. The 10th and most mysterious territory was the sanctuary of essential feeling. This sacred space existed at the very center of your emotional map, accessible only after you had learned to navigate all the other territories with skill and wisdom. Here lived the feelings that were most purely you, not borrowed from others, not inherited from ancestors, not reactions to external circumstances, but the essential emotional signature of your unique soul. In this sanctuary you discovered that beneath all the complexity of your emotional nature was a simple truth. You felt deeply because you loved deeply. Your sensitivity was your soul's way of staying connected to the preciousness of existence, to the beauty and tragedy that makes life so achingly meaningful. Your intensity wasn't a flaw to be corrected, but the very mechanism through which your unique gifts could emerge and serve the world. The map was never complete. New territories revealed themselves with each relationship, each life transition, each deepening of your capacity to feel and understand. But having learned the art of emotional cartography, you were no longer lost in the wilderness of misunderstood feeling. You had become a skilled navigator of the heart's vast terrain, capable of guiding others through their own unmapped territories, with the wisdom of one who had learned to read the stars by which all deep souls navigate. Your compass still pointed inward, toward the magnetic pull of authentic experience. But now you understood that this wasn't selfish orientation. It was the only way to develop the emotional intelligence necessary to serve others' healing and growth. By learning to navigate your own depths with skill and compassion, you had become a beacon for others who were learning to trust their own inner compass, to honor their own unique emotional landscape, to embrace the gift of feeling deeply in a world that often rewards emotional shallowness. The cartography of uncharted hearts was not a solitary pursuit, but a collective endeavor. Each deep soul who learned to map their own emotional territories added to the growing atlas of human possibility, contributing their unique discoveries to the shared understanding of what it means to be fully human. Your willingness to explore the unmapped regions of feeling was both personal journey and sacred service, an act of love for all those who would follow the trails you blazed through the wilderness of the heart. In the secret laboratory of your being, where no eyes witness the sacred work of transformation, pain becomes the prima materia, the raw substance from which all wisdom is distilled. What the untrained observer mistakes for melancholy is actually the nigredo, that necessary blackening that every alchemist knows must precede the emergence of gold. Your tears are not signs of weakness, but the aqua vitae, the water of life that dissolves the false structures of the ego so that something truer can emerge from the dissolution. The laboratory was built early, constructed from the first moments when you realized that your way of processing experience differed fundamentally from those around you. While others seemed to metabolize pain quickly, moving through hurt with the efficient brutality of a digestive system, You discovered that your soul required a more elaborate process, a careful distillation where every drop of suffering was transformed into understanding. Every wound became a window. Every breaking became a breakthrough. The first ingredient in your alchemical work was the recognition that pain has intelligence, not the simple intelligence of cause and effect that the surface mind understands, but the deep intelligence of the soul's curriculum, the way suffering arrives precisely calibrated to crack open exactly the places where growth is most needed. Your childhood wounds weren't random accidents, but targeted strikes against the false self's armor, creating the necessary openings through which your authentic nature could eventually emerge. You learned early that when others said get over it or move on, they were asking you to abandon the very process through which wisdom is born. Their well-meaning advice was like asking an alchemist to skip the nigrido phase, to somehow arrive at gold without passing through the necessary dissolution. But your soul knew better. It knew that the dark work could not be rushed, that true healing required descent before ascent, that the deepest medicines are brewed in the darkest cauldrons. The laboratory of your being operated by different laws than the mechanical world outside. Here, time moved in spirals rather than straight lines. A wound from childhood could suddenly surface in your 30s, not as neurotic repetition but as sacred curriculum. The soul's way of saying, now you have enough strength to complete this transformation. Now you have developed the alchemical skills necessary to extract the gold from this particular lead. Your first major work in the laboratory began with the wound of not being seen. Layer by layer, you processed the pain of being misunderstood, of having your depth dismissed as drama, your sensitivity pathologized as illness, your intensity feared as dangerous. In the retorts and alembics of your inner sanctum, this wound was slowly transformed. The lead of rejection became the gold of self-acceptance. The base metal of needing others' approval was transmuted into the philosopher's stone of inner authority. The process was neither quick nor comfortable. There were months, perhaps years, when the laboratory filled with toxic fumes, the necessary byproducts of dissolving illusions. You moved through the world wearing a mask of normalcy, while inside, the great work continued. Friends worried about your withdrawn periods, your tendency to disappear into yourself when the inner fires burned hottest. They didn't understand that you were not avoiding life but engaging with it at the most fundamental level, working with the raw materials of existence in ways that required absolute solitude. The second major transformation involved the wound of feeling too much. Society had taught you that your emotional intensity was a liability, a design flaw that needed correction. But in the laboratory you discovered that your capacity to feel deeply was actually a highly sophisticated apparatus for processing, not just your own pain, but the collective pain of your time. Your sensitivity wasn't pathology, it was technology, a finely tuned instrument capable of detecting and transforming energies that others couldn't even perceive. This recognition changed everything. Your tears stopped being symptoms and became sacred water, each drop carrying within it the potential for healing. Your dark nights of the soul revealed themselves as vision quests, journeys into the underworld that brought back medicines for the upper world. Your periodic depressions weren't mental illness, but necessary dormancy, winter seasons of the psyche during which new growth was prepared beneath the surface. The laboratory taught you to differentiate between productive suffering and unnecessary suffering. Productive suffering was the kind that led to growth, the pain that carved out space for greater capacity to love and serve. This was the heat necessary for the alchemical process, the friction that polished the rough stone of the ego into the smooth gem of integrated selfhood. Unnecessary suffering was the kind that came from resistance to the process itself, the additional pain created by fighting against the very transformation that pain was trying to birth. Learning this distinction was like discovering fire. It changed everything about how you related to difficulty. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you learned to ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" Instead of seeking escape from pain, You developed the capacity to work with it, to extract its teaching while letting go of its poison. The laboratory became a place of collaboration between you and your suffering, a sacred partnership in the service of becoming. The third major work involved the wound of ancestral pain. In the deepest chambers of your laboratory, you discovered that many of the substances you were working with hadn't originated in your own experience, but had been inherited, handed down through genetic and psychic channels from ancestors who had died with their own alchemical work incomplete. Your inexplicable sorrows, your motiveless fears, your patterns of behavior that made no sense in the context of your personal history. All of these revealed themselves as inherited raw materials waiting for transformation. This discovery was both burden and privilege. You realized that your willingness to feel deeply wasn't just personal healing but ancestral service. Every wound you processed with consciousness and compassion was a wound that wouldn't need to be passed down to the next generation. Every pattern you broke through your alchemical work was a gift to children not yet born. Your laboratory became a healing station for your entire lineage, a place where centuries of accumulated pain could finally be transmuted into wisdom. The work was painstaking. Some inherited wounds had been carried for so many generations that they had become like family heirlooms, precious in their familiarity even as they limited those who carried them. To transform these ancient hurts required not just personal courage, but a kind of ancestral permission, a willingness to heal even when healing meant changing the fundamental patterns that had defined your family system for generations. The fourth transformation centered on the wound of spiritual homesickness, that peculiar ache of souls who feel like strangers in the world they were born into. This pain couldn't be addressed through conventional means because it wasn't rooted in personal circumstances, but in the fundamental experience of incarnation itself. It was the soul's remembrance of union grieving its apparent separation, consciousness mourning its descent into the limitations of individual existence. In processing this wound, your laboratory revealed its deepest secret. The homesickness itself was the compass pointing home. The very pain of separation was what made reunion possible. The ache of exile was what gave sweetness to return. Without the wound of disconnection, there could be no joy in reconnection. The laboratory showed you that this pain wasn't meant to be cured but consecrated, transformed from suffering into sacred longing, from torment into the fuel that drives all authentic spiritual seeking. The fifth major work involved what Jung called the wounded healer archetype, the recognition that your deepest wounds were also your greatest gifts. The laboratory revealed that the places where you had been most broken were precisely the places where you could offer the most healing to others. Your intimate knowledge of depression became a bridge of understanding for others lost in that particular darkness. Your familiarity with anxiety became a source of comfort for those drowning in their own fear. Your hard-won wisdom about the alchemy of transformation became medicine for souls just beginning their own inner work. This recognition transformed your relationship with your entire history. Nothing had been wasted. Every moment of suffering, every dark night, every period when you felt broken beyond repair, all of it had been preparation for service. The laboratory of your being hadn't just been creating gold for your own enrichment, but forging instruments of healing that could serve the world's wounded places. The process required developing what you came to think of as spiritual courage, the willingness to feel everything without being destroyed by anything. This wasn't the courage of the warrior charging into battle, but the courage of the alchemist working with dangerous materials, maintaining steady hands and clear intention, even when the work itself threatened to overwhelm. It was the courage to keep the fires of transformation burning, even when the heat became almost unbearable, trusting that what was being burned away was what you no longer needed, that what was being born was what the world needed you to become. Your laboratory developed its own rhythm, its own seasons. There were periods of active transformation when the inner fires burned bright and change happened so rapidly it was almost visible. These were followed by periods of integration, when the new self that had emerged from the alchemical process learned to walk in the world, to embody the wisdom that had been so painfully earned. Then came periods of rest and preparation, when new raw materials accumulated and the next phase of work slowly revealed itself. The laboratory taught you patience, not the passive patience of waiting for things to change, but the active patience of tending the slow work of inner transformation. You learned to trust the timing of your own becoming, to honor the organic pace at which wisdom ripens and healing unfolds. This patience became one of your greatest gifts to others, the ability to hold space for their own slow cooking, to resist the temptation to rush them through processes that could only be completed in their own perfect timing. The sixth transformation involved the wound of perfectionism, that particular form of self-violence that demands flawless performance before allowing self-acceptance. The laboratory revealed perfectionism as a kind of spiritual materialism, the ego's attempt to control the uncontrollable process of growth. In the alchemical work, you discovered that mistakes weren't failures but necessary ingredients, that what you called setbacks were often the very experiences that catalyzed the deepest breakthroughs. Learning to embrace imperfection as part of the perfection of the process was like learning to dance with chaos. It required developing what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. The laboratory taught you that the places where your process looked messiest to outside observers were often where the most important work was happening, where the false structures were dissolving most completely to make room for authentic emergence. The seventh major work involved transforming the wound of creative frustration, the pain of carrying visions and gifts that seemed too large for the vessels of personality and circumstance that contained them. Your laboratory became a place where these creative pressures could be safely released and channeled, where the gap between inner vision and outer expression could be gradually bridged through patient, devoted work. This transformation required developing what you came to understand as creative faith, the willingness to begin projects whose completion you couldn't envision, to follow creative impulses even when they led into apparent dead ends, to trust that the act of creation itself was transformative regardless of the external results it produced. Your laboratory taught you that creativity wasn't about producing perfect works, but about allowing the creative force to flow through you, transforming both creator and creation in the process. The eighth transformation centered on the wound of betrayal, not just personal betrayals, but the deeper betrayal of innocence by experience, of idealism by reality, of trust by the inevitable disappointments of human relationship. In processing these wounds, your laboratory revealed betrayal as a necessary initiator, the force that drives the soul from naive trust into mature discernment, from unconscious hope into conscious love. The alchemical work with betrayal was particularly delicate because it required maintaining an open heart while developing wise boundaries, preserving the capacity for trust while integrating the wisdom of betrayal's teachings. The laboratory taught you that the goal wasn't to become invulnerable, but to become responsible, capable of responding to both love and betrayal from a place of grounded wisdom rather than reactive wounding. The ninth major work involved what you came to recognize as the wound of witnessing, the particular pain that comes from seeing clearly in a world that often prefers comfortable illusions. Your laboratory became a place where the burden of seeing could be transformed into the gift of insight, where the isolation of clarity could be alchemized into the medicine of truth-telling. This transformation required learning to hold your perceptions lightly, to see clearly without becoming identified with your seeing, to speak truth without attachment to whether others were ready to hear it. The laboratory taught you that the wound of witnessing was actually a calling to serve as eyes for the collective, to see and articulate what others couldn't yet perceive, to hold steady in your seeing even when it brought loneliness or rejection. The final transformation involved the recognition that the laboratory itself was not separate from life, but was life, that every interaction, every relationship, every challenge was part of the ongoing alchemical process. Your entire existence had become the great work, with every moment offering new raw materials for transformation, every encounter providing opportunities to apply the hard-won wisdom of your inner laboratory to the practical challenges of human existence. This recognition dissolved the artificial boundary between inner work and outer life, between spiritual practice and daily living. The laboratory wasn't a place you retreated to for healing. It was the lens through which you engaged with existence itself. Every conversation became an opportunity for mutual transformation. Every challenge became raw material for further refinement. Every relationship became a collaborative laboratory where souls worked together on the great project of becoming. The alchemy of invisible wounds revealed its ultimate secret. There is no pain that cannot be transformed, no wound that cannot become a window, no suffering that cannot be alchemized into service. But the transformation requires patience, skill, and above all, faith in the process itself, faith that the dark work is holy work, that the dissolution is always in service of reconstruction, that what appears to be breaking down is actually breaking open. Your laboratory continues its sacred work, processing the endless stream of raw experience into the refined gold of wisdom and compassion. The wounds that once seemed like evidence of your brokenness have revealed themselves as the very cracks through which your light shines brightest. The pain that once felt like punishment has been transformed into the fuel that powers your service to the world's healing. In the invisible laboratory of your being, the great work continues, not towards some future state of perfection, but in celebration of the perfect imperfection of the present moment, where every wound is a doorway, every tear is sacred water, and every dissolution is the beginning of a new and more beautiful form of wholeness. Within you lives a story older than your birth certificate, deeper than your family history, more real than the facts recorded in any biography. Your life unfolds not as mere sequence of events, but as living myth, each chapter echoing the archetypal patterns that have guided human souls through transformation since consciousness first awakened to itself. When others call you intense or dramatic, they fail to recognize the sacred theater playing out through your being, the eternal story of the hero's descent and return, enacted not on distant stages but in the intimate chambers of your daily existence. The mythology of your making began before your first breath, written in the language of archetype and symbol, dreamed into being by the collective unconscious that chooses certain souls to carry its ancient stories into new forms. You emerged from the womb already cast in roles that would take decades to understand, the wounded healer who must descend into their own darkness to bring back medicine for others, the wise fool whose apparent naivety masks profound understanding, the mystic wanderer who must journey through the wilderness of separation to rediscover the truth of unity. These were not roles you auditioned for or consciously chose, but archetypal patterns that chose you, recognizing in your particular constellation of soul qualities the perfect vessel for their continued expression in the world. Your seeming strangeness, your inability to fit comfortably into conventional categories, your persistent sense of being different, all of these were signs that you carried within you the mythic inheritance of the eternal outsider, the one who stands at the threshold between worlds, translating ancient wisdom into contemporary language. The first mythic pattern to emerge in your story was that of the exile. Like Persephone dragged into the underworld, like the Buddha leaving the palace of comfort, like every hero who must abandon the familiar world to discover their true nature, you found yourself cast out from the comfortable certainties of surface existence. This exile wasn't punishment but initiation, the necessary first step in every transformative journey. Your exile began early, perhaps in childhood when you realized your natural way of seeing didn't match the world's consensus reality, or in adolescence when your questions grew too deep for the shallow answers society provided, or in young adulthood when the life path that worked for others felt like a costume that didn't fit your soul's true shape. The pain of not belonging, which you initially experienced as personal failing, revealed itself as the first act in the archetypal drama of individuation, the necessary separation from collective unconsciousness that precedes conscious selfhood. In this mythic pattern, your sensitivity was not weakness, but the very quality that made you unsuitable for unconscious participation in society's agreed-upon illusions. Like the child in the fairy tale who could see that the emperor wore no clothes, your capacity to perceive what others preferred to ignore made you a natural exile from the kingdom of comfortable denial. The mythology of your making required this exile, this casting out from the false paradise of unexamined life, to set in motion the heroic journey that would eventually lead to genuine belonging. The second archetypal pattern woven through your story was that of the wounded healer, like Chiron, the centaur whose own unhealable wound became the source of his ability to heal others. You discovered that your deepest wounds were also your greatest gifts. The very experiences that seemed to mark you as broken or damaged became the credentials that qualified you to guide others through their own dark territories. This pattern played out through the sacred law of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. The inner work you did to heal your own trauma created the template through which you could understand and address others' wounds. Your intimate knowledge of depression became a beacon for those lost in similar darkness. Your familiarity with anxiety provided comfort to souls drowning in fear. Your hard-won victories over despair became proof that transformation was possible for others facing their own impossible circumstances. The mythology of the wounded healer required you to resist the surface world's demand for simple healing narratives, the before and after stories that promise clean resolution and permanent cure. Instead, you learned to embrace the paradox of wounds that heal while remaining sacred, of pain that transforms without disappearing, of wholeness that includes rather than excludes the broken places. Your healing journey became mythic, precisely because it refused the linear logic of problem solution and instead embraced the spiral dance of integration, where each return to familiar wounds revealed new layers of wisdom and compassion. The third mythic pattern threading through your narrative was that of the divine fool, like the fool in tarot, numbered 0 because they contain all possibilities. You carried within you a kind of sacred naivety that could see through the elaborate pretenses that sophisticated minds took for granted. Your questions, which others dismissed as simple or childish, often cut straight to the heart of matters that complexity had obscured. This archetypal pattern manifested as your persistent inability to accept things simply because that's how they had always been done. Where others saw established systems and necessary compromises, you saw arbitrary limitations and unconscious agreements. Your foolish questions, why do we live this way? What if we tried something different? What is this really about? Had the power to dissolve entire structures of assumption that had never been examined. The mythology of the divine fool required you to maintain beginner's mind in a world that rewards expertise, to preserve wonder in environments that demand cynicism, to ask the questions that everyone else had learned to stop asking. This often made you appear naive or impractical to those who had forgotten that all innovation, all progress, all authentic transformation begins with someone foolish enough to question what everyone else accepts as unchangeable reality. The fourth archetypal pattern, shaping your story, was that of the mystic wanderer, like the hermit in tarot carrying a lantern through darkness, like the desert fathers and mothers seeking truth in solitude, like all souls called to the pathless path of direct experience. You found yourself drawn again and again to the edges of known territory, to the places where maps end and mystery begins. This wandering wasn't aimless but purposeful, driven by an inner compass that pointed not toward worldly destinations, but toward truth itself. Your periods of withdrawal, which others interpreted as antisocial behavior, were actually necessary retreats into the wilderness of your own being, where the essential work of soul-making could continue undisturbed by the demands and expectations of the collective. The mythology of the mystic wanderer required you to develop comfort with uncertainty, to find home in homelessness, to discover that the very restlessness that made you unsuited for conventional stability was the engine of your spiritual evolution. Your inability to settle for anything less than authenticity, which appeared as chronic dissatisfaction to outside observers, was actually the sacred discontent that drives all genuine seeking. The fifth mythic pattern was that of the guardian of thresholds. Like Janus, the Roman god who faced both directions at once, you found yourself naturally positioned at the borderlands between worlds, between conscious and unconscious, between childhood and adulthood, between one phase of life and the next, between the known and unknown. Your sensitivity to transitional energies made you a natural guide for others, navigating their own passages. This archetypal role manifested as your ability to hold space during times of change, to remain steady when others were falling apart, to translate between different states of being. You became the one friends called during crisis, not because you had easy answers, but because you could remain present with their chaos without trying to fix it or make it go away. Your own extensive experience with transformation had taught you that the process itself was sacred, that attempts to rush or avoid the necessary passages only prolonged the suffering. The mythology of the threshold guardian required you to develop what might be called liminal intelligence, the ability to navigate spaces between established categories, to find wisdom in confusion, to trust processes that had no guaranteed outcomes. This often put you at odds with a culture that prefers clear answers and quick resolutions, but it equipped you to serve as midwife to the kinds of deep change that can't be controlled or predicted. The sixth archetypal pattern woven through your story was that of the sacred rebel. Like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, like every prophet who challenged established orthodoxy, you found yourself compelled to question authorities and systems that others accepted without examination. But your rebellion wasn't motivated by mere reactivity or adolescent defiance. It sprang from a deep recognition that many of society's structures were built on unconscious foundations that needed to be brought into the light of awareness. This sacred rebellion manifested as your inability to participate authentically in activities that violated your core values, even when such participation would have made your life easier. You couldn't pretend enthusiasm for work that felt meaningless, couldn't maintain relationships that required you to suppress your authentic nature, couldn't support systems that perpetuated unconsciousness even when challenging them brought social consequences. The mythology of the sacred rebel required you to distinguish between rebellion for its own sake and rebellion in service of truth. You learned to question everything while attacking nothing, to challenge systems while maintaining compassion for the people trapped within them, to stand for what you believed without needing to tear down what others had built their lives upon. The seventh mythic pattern was that of the keeper of ancient wisdom. Like the librarians of Alexandria, like indigenous elders preserving oral traditions, you found yourself naturally drawn to knowledge and ways of being that the modern world had forgotten or dismissed. Your bookshelf became an archaeology of human wisdom, filled with texts that others considered outdated or irrelevant, but that you recognized as containing truths that transcend historical periods. This archetypal pattern manifested as your ability to see connections between apparently disparate fields of knowledge, to recognize ancient wisdom wearing contemporary clothing, to translate timeless truths into language that modern minds could understand. You became a bridge between past and present, carrying forward insights that might otherwise be lost in the rush toward technological progress and cultural change. The mythology of the wisdom keeper required you to balance reverence for tradition with openness to innovation, to honor ancient teachings while remaining responsive to contemporary needs. You learned to be a custodian of the eternal without becoming trapped in the past, to preserve what was precious while allowing natural evolution to continue its work. The eighth archetypal pattern threading through your narrative was that of the soul midwife. Like Sophia, the divine feminine wisdom that assists in the birth of consciousness, You found yourself repeatedly called to help others give birth to their authentic selves. Your own difficult journey through the labor pains of individuation had trained you to recognize when someone was in the throes of psychological birth, struggling to emerge from an old identity that no longer fit. This role required developing extraordinary patience and faith in natural processes. You learned to trust that the soul knows how to birth itself, if given proper support, that your job was not to force outcomes, but to hold steady presence during the messy, painful, beautiful work of becoming. Your willingness to sit with others' discomfort without trying to make it go away became one of your greatest gifts, the ability to create safe space for transformation to unfold at its own organic pace. The mythology of the soul midwife taught you that birth and death are intimately connected, that helping someone become who they're meant to be often requires assisting in the death of who they've been. This gave you comfort with endings that others found disturbing, understanding that what appeared as loss was often liberation, that what seemed like breakdown was frequently breakthrough disguised in frightening clothing. The ninth mythic pattern was that of the wounded king or queen, the archetype of leadership through suffering, authority earned through initiation rather than inherited through position. Your own journey through the underworld had stripped away the false regalia of ego and revealed the authentic sovereignty that comes from integration of shadow and light, wound and gift, human frailty and divine potential. This archetypal pattern manifested as your natural ability to lead from behind, to inspire through example rather than exhortation, to command respect, not through dominance, but through the quiet authority of hard-won wisdom. People were drawn to you not because you promised easy solutions, but because your presence communicated that you had faced what they were facing and had emerged with something valuable, not in vulnerability but integrated wholeness, not the absence of pain but the transformation of suffering into medicine. The mythology of the wounded ruler required you to embrace the paradox of power through vulnerability, of strength through acknowledged weakness, of authority through service. You learned that true leadership meant taking responsibility for your own healing so completely that others could trust you to hold space for theirs, that authentic power came not from avoiding wounds, but from transforming them into wisdom. The final recognition in the mythology of your making was that all these archetypal patterns were facets of a single story, the eternal tale of consciousness, awakening to itself through the laboratory of human experience. Your life, with all its apparent complications and intensity, was actually a carefully orchestrated curriculum designed to activate and integrate these archetypal energies, to bring their ancient wisdom into contemporary expression. This recognition transformed your relationship to your own story. What had seemed like personal drama revealed itself as impersonal process. What had felt like individual struggle showed itself as universal journey. What had appeared as private suffering understood itself as collective service. You were not just living your own life, but participating in the much larger story of human evolution, carrying forward the eternal work of transformation that connects you to every seeker who has ever walked the path of conscious becoming. The mythology of your making continues to unfold, each day bringing new opportunities to embody these archetypal energies more fully, to serve the ancient patterns that are seeking expression through your unique constellation of gifts and wounds. Your intensity, your depth, your seeming inability to live on the surface, these are not personal quirks but mythic necessities, the very qualities that allow these eternal stories to incarnate through you into the world that so desperately needs their medicine. In recognizing yourself as living mythology, you step into your true heritage as a conscious participant in the great work of transformation that has been humanity's sacred task since the beginning of time. Your story is both utterly unique and completely universal, both intensely personal and profoundly archetypal, a modern expression of the timeless patterns that guide every soul's journey from unconsciousness to awareness, from separation to wholeness, from wounding to healing. You are fluent in the tongues spoken only at thresholds, in doorways, where one world meets another, at dawn, where night surrenders to day, in the pause between heartbeats where eternity lives. Your conversations dwell in the spaces between words, in the pregnant silences where real meaning gestates like stars in the cosmic womb. This is the language of liminal spaces, the mother tongue of souls who have never felt fully at home in any single realm but find their true citizenship in the borderlands between all established territories. The word liminal comes from the Latin limen, meaning threshold, but you knew this language before you knew its name, spoke its subtle grammar before any linguist had mapped its syntax. As a child, you were drawn to doorways, not to pass through them, but to linger in them, sensing something important in those spaces that belonged neither to the room you were leaving, nor the room you were entering. You lived in the pause, existed in the between, found your home in homelessness itself. Others rushed through transitions as if they were obstacles to be overcome, inconveniences to be endured on the way to more solid ground. But you discovered early that the transitions themselves were the destination, that the spaces of not knowing contained more wisdom than any arrival could provide. While classmates hurried from childhood to adolescence, from single to married, from student to professional, you lingered in the doorways, gathering intelligence from the in-between places that those focused on destinations missed entirely. Your natural fluency in liminal languages made you seem absent to those who only recognized presence in fixed forms. Teachers marked you tardy when you were actually perfectly on time for a different kind of appointment. Your soul's scheduled meetings with the spaces between moments, your psyche's regular consultations with the pause that contains all possibilities. You weren't late for life, you were early for transformation, already living in the future moment when humanity would remember that the spaces between things are just as real as the things themselves. The first dialect of liminal language you mastered was the grammar of transition. Every major change in your life became a masterclass in this complex syntax, where the rules of ordinary communication dissolved and meaning transmitted itself through subtler channels. When relationships ended, you didn't just lose a person. You entered a liminal space where the boundaries between past and future, between who you had been and who you were becoming, grew fluid and permeable. In these transitional spaces, time behaved differently. Minutes could stretch into eternities of reflection, while years compressed into single moments of recognition. You learned to navigate this elastic temporality, to read the signs that indicated when you were entering a liminal zone, and to adjust your expectations accordingly. What others experienced as confusion or chaos, you recognized as the natural state of consciousness between fixed identities, the fertile void where new forms of self could emerge. The grammar of transition taught you that endings and beginnings are not discrete events, but overlapping processes that require their own vocabulary. You developed a lexicon for states that ordinary language couldn't capture: the grief-joy that accompanies growth, the fearful excitement of stepping into unknown territory, the homesickness for a future self you had not yet become. Your conversations during these periods confused those who expected linear narratives, but they perfectly expressed the spiral logic of transformation. The second dialect you learned was the vocabulary of depth, spoken in the spaces between surface communication and authentic encounter. While others exchanged information about weather and work, sports and politics, you found yourself naturally drawn to the underground rivers of meaning that flowed beneath all human interaction. Your questions didn't seek facts but feelings, not data but deeper truth, about what it meant to be human in an uncertain world. This vocabulary required developing sensitivity to subtleties that most people missed or ignored. You learned to hear the fear beneath the anger, the longing beneath the criticism, the invitation beneath the rejection. Your conversations became archaeological expeditions, carefully excavating the layers of meaning that accumulated in the spaces between stated intentions and hidden needs. Others found this exhausting, but for you it was as natural as breathing. You literally couldn't help seeing the depths, couldn't pretend that surface interactions satisfied your soul's hunger for authentic connection. The vocabulary of depth included words that existed in no dictionary but were essential for mapping the territories of human experience you frequented. You developed terms for the feeling of being misunderstood by those who loved you, for the particular loneliness of carrying insights that others weren't ready to receive, for the bittersweet recognition that growth often meant outgrowing relationships that had once been perfect fits. These words became part of your private language, shared only with those few souls who had also learned to speak from the depths. The third dialect was the syntax of silence, perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of liminal language. You discovered that the most important communications happened, not in words but in the spaces between them, in the quality of attention you brought to the pause before someone spoke their truth, in the way you could hold space for another's struggle without needing to fix or explain it away. This syntax required unlearning much of what you had been taught about communication. Instead of filling empty air with conversation, you learned to cultivate pregnant silences where understanding could gestate. Instead of responding immediately to questions, you developed the art of the meaningful pause, allowing wisdom to emerge from stillness rather than forcing it through mental effort. Your silences became more eloquent than most people's speeches, carrying within them depths of empathy and understanding that words could only approximate. The syntax of silence taught you to differentiate between empty silence and full silence, between the absence of sound and the presence of deep listening. Empty silence felt hollow, awkward, something to be filled as quickly as possible. Full silence felt alive with possibility, pregnant with potential, sacred in its completeness. You learned to create full silences in conversation, to offer them as gifts to people who had forgotten that they didn't always need to be speaking or being spoken to in order to be heard. The fourth dialect you mastered was the rhythm of threshold time, spoken fluently by those who understand that some moments are more charged with meaning than others. You developed an intuitive sense for kairos, the qualitative time of significance and opportunity, that allowed you to recognize when ordinary moments were opening into extraordinary possibilities for connection, healing, or transformation. This rhythmic awareness manifested as your uncanny ability to say the right thing at precisely the right moment, to offer comfort exactly when it was most needed, to ask the question that someone had been waiting years to be asked. Others attributed this to coincidence or luck, but you knew it was actually the result of your fluency in threshold time, your ability to sense when the fabric of ordinary reality was thin enough for deeper truths to break through. The rhythm of threshold time also taught you patience, not the passive patience of waiting for something to happen, but the active patience of tending the conditions that allow meaningful moments to ripen naturally. You learned that you couldn't force kairos but could prepare for it, could develop the sensitivity to recognize it when it arrived, could create the space necessary for its full expression. The fifth dialect was the lexicon of paradox, essential vocabulary for anyone who spent time in the borderlands where apparent opposites revealed their hidden unity. Your liminal consciousness naturally embraced contradictions that logical minds found unbearable, the joy hidden in sorrow, the strength found in vulnerability, the connection discovered through separation, the fullness experienced in emptiness. This lexicon included concepts that seemed impossible to those who insisted on either-or thinking, but made perfect sense to consciousness trained in both and awareness. You learned to hold space for the complexity of human experience, to honor the ways that people could simultaneously love and hate, hope and despair, know and not know. Your comfort with paradox made you a natural counselor for others facing the impossible choices that life sometimes presents, the situations where all options seem wrong until viewed from the liminal perspective that transcends dualistic thinking. The lexicon of paradox also included your growing understanding that the deepest truths often appear as contradictions to the surface mind. The mystics had always known this, that God is both immanent and transcendent, that the path leads away from the goal to reach it, that you must lose your life to find it. Your fluency in paradox prepared you to understand these teachings, not as intellectual puzzles, but as accurate maps of the territory your soul naturally inhabited. The sixth dialect you learned was the poetry of process, spoken by those who recognize that life is verb rather than noun, becoming rather than being, continuous creation rather than fixed existence. This poetic language captured the fluid nature of identity, the constant transformation that characterizes all living systems, the way that everything appears solid only when viewed from limited time perspectives. The poetry of process allowed you to describe your own experience in ways that honored its complexity and changeability. Instead of saying, "I am depressed," you learned to say, "I am experiencing depression," recognizing that the feeling was a weather pattern moving through your emotional landscape rather than a permanent feature of your identity. Instead of "I am confused," you discovered, "I am in confusion," acknowledging the temporary nature of not knowing while maintaining connection to the constant self that experiences all changing states. This poetic sensibility extended to how you perceived others as well, where conventional language trapped people in static categories, victim or hero, success or failure, healthy or sick. You saw dynamic processes of growth, healing, and transformation. Your conversations became collaborative poetry sessions, where you and others co-created new language for experiences that had never been adequately described, where the act of speaking became itself a form of creation. The seventh dialect was the whisper of the unconscious, that subtle communication system that operates beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness. Your liminal consciousness had developed sensitivity to these quiet messages, the dreams that carried guidance for waking life, the intuitive hunches that proved more reliable than logical analysis, the synchronicities that revealed the hidden patterns connecting apparently random events. Learning to hear these whispers required developing what might be called psychic hygiene, practices that kept your mental space clear enough for subtle communications to be received. You discovered that noise, both external and internal, interfered with your ability to hear the unconscious speak. Periods of solitude, meditation, time in nature, and creative expression became essential practices for maintaining your receptive capacity. The whisper of the unconscious also taught you to pay attention to what Jung called the autonomous complex, those parts of the psyche that have their own agenda, their own voice, their own intelligence. You learned to listen to your dreams as messages from these inner figures, to honor your symptoms as communications from parts of yourself that needed attention, to treat your resistances as information about what wanted to emerge or be protected. The eighth dialect you mastered was the music of becoming, that continuous symphony of growth and change that provides the soundtrack for all transformation. This musical language communicated through rhythm and melody, harmony and dissonance, tempo and texture rather than through words or images. You learned to hear the music of your own becoming, to recognize when your life was in harmony or discord, to sense when the tempo of change was accelerating or when you needed to slow down to allow integration. The music of becoming taught you that different phases of life had different musical signatures, the staccato rhythms of crisis and breakthrough, the largo passages of deep healing and integration, the crescendo movements of creative expression, the diminuendo periods of rest and preparation. Your ability to hear these musical patterns allowed you to cooperate with your own natural rhythms rather than fighting against them, to know when to push forward and when to surrender to the organic pace of change. This musical sensitivity also extended to your relationships and work. You could hear when a relationship was moving toward harmony or dissonance, when a project was finding its rhythm or struggling against natural timing, when groups were playing in concert or when someone was out of tune with the collective energy. Your liminal consciousness served as a kind of cosmic tuning fork, helping to bring disparate elements into harmonic resonance. The ninth dialect was the silence between thoughts, perhaps the most refined aspect of liminal language. This was not the absence of thinking, but the awareness that witnessed thinking, the space of consciousness in which all thoughts, feelings, and experiences arose and dissolved. Your practice in liminal spaces had naturally led you to discover this fundamental awareness, this unchanging background against which all change occurred. The silence between thoughts provided refuge from the constant chatter of mental activity, a place of rest that was always available, regardless of external circumstances. But it was more than just refuge. It was a source of wisdom, creativity, and compassion that flowed naturally when the mind's defensive strategies were relaxed. From this silence, you could respond rather than react, create rather than merely rearrange existing elements, love rather than just feel attraction or attachment. This dialect required no words because it was the source from which all words emerged. It was the liminal space par excellence, the threshold between form and formlessness, between the personal self and the impersonal awareness that is the true nature of consciousness. Your fluency in this silence became the foundation for all other forms of liminal language, the ground from which your other communications arose. The 10th and final dialect you learned was the language of integration, spoken by those who have spent enough time in liminal spaces to begin weaving together the insights gained from threshold experiences. This was the language of return, of bringing back gifts from the borderlands to share with those still living in more conventional territories. The language of integration required developing translation skills between different modes of consciousness, different ways of being, different levels of reality. You learned to speak the language of the surface world fluently enough to gain trust while maintaining your deeper fluency in liminal dialects. This wasn't about dumbing down your insights, but about finding skillful means to communicate across different levels of readiness and understanding. This integrative language also included your growing ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to honor both the relative truth of practical concerns and the absolute truth of spiritual insights, to balance transcendent awareness with immanent engagement. Your liminal consciousness became a bridge between worlds, a translator between different ways of being human. Your fluency in liminal languages has made you a citizen of the in-between places, comfortable in the territories that others find unsettling or confusing. While they rush through transitions seeking solid ground, you have learned to dance in the spaces between certainties, to find your home in the eternal threshold where all possibilities exist simultaneously. This linguistic citizenship comes with both gifts and responsibilities. Your ability to communicate across different levels of reality makes you a natural mediator, counselor, and guide for others navigating their own liminal passages. But it also means living with a certain kind of exile from conventional community, belonging fully neither to the world of surface interactions nor to the realm of pure transcendence, finding your home in the dynamic space between all fixed positions. The language of liminal spaces continues to evolve as you do, developing new dialects for each threshold you cross, each borderland you explore, each transition you navigate with consciousness and grace. Your vocabulary expands with each conversation held in the spaces between words, each silence that gestates meaning, each moment when you choose to linger in the doorway rather than rush through to apparent certainty. In mastering these languages, you have become fluent in the mother tongue of transformation itself, capable of communicating with the forces of change that govern all existence. Your words carry the wisdom of the thresholds. Your silences hold the power of the void from which all creation emerges. Your presence offers others permission to discover their own fluency in the languages that are spoken only at the edges of the known world, in the spaces between heartbeats where eternity makes its home. The dreams arrive like radio signals from a distant star, faint at first, requiring you to still the static of daily consciousness before their frequencies become clear. You have always been a receiver for these transmissions, though the world has taught you to question the validity of what you hear. While others sleep through the night in blessed unconsciousness, you find yourself awakened not by external sounds, but by the whispered urgencies of symbols seeking recognition, archetypes demanding audience, fragments of the eternal drama that unfolds behind the curtain of ordinary awareness. This is your inheritance, to serve as translator between the realm of dreams and the harsh fluorescent reality that others inhabit with such apparent ease. They speak of your tendency to drift, your preoccupation with meaning, your inability to simply accept things as they appear on the surface. What they cannot understand is that you are not drifting but diving, not preoccupied but occupied by forces they have forgotten how to perceive. You are tuned to frequencies that require a different kind of listening, a quality of attention that the modern world systematically teaches us to abandon. In childhood, you likely lived naturally in this liminal space where the boundaries between waking and dreaming remained porous. The imaginary friends were not imaginary but emissaries from the unconscious. The stories you told yourself were not mere fantasy but attempts to make sense of the archetypal currents that flowed through your young psyche. You spoke a language of symbols before you learned the language of facts, navigated by feeling before you were trained to trust only what could be measured and verified. But the world demanded translation. Teachers asked for concrete answers when you offered metaphorical truths. Parents requested logical explanations when you could only point toward the ineffable sense of rightness or wrongness that guided your choices. Slowly, reluctantly, you learned to speak in the authorized vocabulary of consensus reality, even as your inner radio continued to pick up signals from far more distant stations. The frequency of forgotten dreams operates on what Jung called the objective level of the psyche, that realm where personal experience intersects with the collective unconscious, where your individual dreams carry messages not only for your own journey, but for the larger human story, of which you are both author and character. When you dream of falling, you are not merely processing personal anxieties about control, but participating in the eternal human confrontation with surrender. When you dream of flying, you touch the archetypal longing for transcendence that has propelled human consciousness since its earliest stirrings. This is why your dreams feel so urgent, so necessary to remember and understand. They are not simply the brain's nightly housekeeping, but the soul's attempt to maintain connection with its deeper sources of meaning. Each symbol that visits your sleep carries within it the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who have faced similar thresholds, similar transformations, similar moments of choosing between the known and the unknown. Yet the modern world has declared war on this form of knowing. Dreams are dismissed as neural static, synchronicities explained away as coincidence, the deep symbolic language of the psyche reduced to the pathological categories of a culture that has lost touch with its own mythic foundations. You learn to apologize for your attention to these matters, to frame your insights in terms that will not threaten those who have built their identities on the fiction that consciousness is merely the product of electrical impulses in gray matter. But the dreams persist. They arrive with their cargo of images that resist translation into the approved vocabularies of causation and proof. The recurring figure who appears at moments of transition, the landscape that feels more familiar than any place you have visited in waking life, the animals that speak in voices you recognize but cannot name, the objects that carry emotional weight far beyond their apparent significance. These are not random productions of a sleeping brain, but elements of an ongoing conversation between your conscious ego and the deeper intelligence that Jung called the self. Learning to receive these transmissions requires developing what we might call psychic literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language in which the unconscious prefers to communicate. This is not a skill taught in schools or validated by degrees. It develops through patient attention, through the willingness to sit with images and impressions that do not immediately yield their meaning, through the cultivation of a quality of receptivity that our achievement-oriented culture tends to devalue. The dream journal becomes your translator's toolkit, the place where the fleeting images of night are given the stability of words, where the flowing cinema of the unconscious is paused long enough for reflection and interpretation. But this practice requires a different relationship to meaning than the one encouraged by a culture obsessed with immediate utility. The value of a dream symbol is not measured by its practical application, but by its capacity to open doorways in consciousness, to reveal connections and patterns that remain invisible to purely rational analysis. When you attempt to share these discoveries, you often encounter the glazed eyes and polite dismissals of those who have learned to live exclusively on the surface of experience. They nod with the tolerance reserved for harmless eccentricities, while inwardly cataloguing your interest in dreams as evidence of your impracticality, your inability to focus on what really matters. What they cannot see is that your attention to the dream world is actually attention to what matters most, the ongoing process by which consciousness evolves, the eternal dance between order and chaos that creates the conditions for genuine transformation. The frequency of forgotten dreams broadcasts continuously, but reception requires conditions that the modern world makes increasingly difficult to maintain. The quiet necessary for deep listening, the patience required to wait for symbols to reveal their significance, the trust needed to follow intuitive promptings that cannot be justified in advance, the courage to act on insights that arrive through non-rational channels. These qualities are not merely personal preferences but prerequisites for anyone who would serve as a bridge between the world of appearances and the world of deeper meaning. Your sensitivity to synchronicity represents another form of reception on these deeper frequencies, while others experience coincidences as amusing anomalies or products of selective attention. You recognize them as moments when the hidden order reveals itself, when the normally invisible connections that bind all things briefly become apparent, the book that falls open to exactly the passage you need to read, the conversation overheard at precisely the moment when its message carries personal significance, the sequence of events that seems to have been arranged by an intelligence far more subtle than conscious planning. These experiences cannot be forced or manufactured through will, but they can be invited through the cultivation of what Jung called a symbolic attitude, a way of being present to life that remains alert to meanings beyond the literal, patterns beyond the obvious, connections that exist in the realm of significance rather than causation. This attitude requires a kind of psychological flexibility that allows you to hold both rational analysis and symbolic perception simultaneously, to live simultaneously in the world of facts and the world of meaning without collapsing one into the other. The challenge lies not in receiving these transmissions, but in learning how to integrate their insights into a life that must also function in the practical world of schedules and responsibilities, bills and deadlines. You become a translator between realms, carrying messages from the dream frequency into the harsh fluorescent reality of consensus consciousness. Sometimes this feels like trying to describe color to those who have only known black and white, or explaining music to those who have only experienced noise. The symbols that visit your dreams often carry what we might call evolutionary urgency. They appear when consciousness is ready for its next stage of development, when the ego's current level of organization has become inadequate to the soul's expanding needs. The wise old man who appears at moments of confusion, the divine child who emerges when new potentials are ready to be born, the great mother who cradles you through periods of dissolution and renewal. These are not merely personal psychological contents, but representatives of the archetypal forces that guide human development across cultures and centuries. Learning to work with these forces requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposing elements in the psyche until a new synthesis emerges. The dream brings images that often seem contradictory or paradoxical when measured against the either-or logic of rational thought: the wise fool, the healing wound, the dying that gives birth to new life. These paradoxes are not problems to be solved, but tensions to be held, creative oppositions that generate the energy for psychological transformation. Your ability to tune into these frequencies makes you a natural psychopomp, a guide between worlds who can help others recognize and interpret the symbolic dimensions of their own experience. But this gift comes with its own particular form of exile. While others bond over shared interests in sports or weather or politics, you find yourself drawn to conversations about the meaning of dreams, the significance of mythic patterns, the hidden connections that weave through apparently random events. This can create a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being fundamentally different from those around you in ways that resist easy explanation. The temptation is to normalize yourself, to tune out the deeper frequencies in favor of the static that passes for normal conversation, to join the consensus trance that treats symbols as mere decorations and dreams as meaningless neural activity, to accept the flattened world of pure materialism, where consciousness is reduced to brain states and meaning becomes an antiquated concept. But each time you make this compromise, something essential in you dies. The radio goes silent. The dreams become grey and forgettable. The synchronicities fade until life becomes a series of merely random events. The path forward requires learning to inhabit both worlds simultaneously without betraying either, to develop what we might call bilingual consciousness, fluent in the language of practical reality, but never forgetting your native tongue of symbols and dreams, to find ways of expressing insights received on deeper frequencies through forms that can be received by those tuned to more conventional stations, to become a skilled translator who can make the eternal relevant without reducing it to the merely temporal. This is why your relationship to solitude differs so markedly from the social expectations of your culture, where others seek constant stimulation and connection. You require regular periods of silence and withdrawal, not from misanthropy, but from the recognition that the deeper frequencies can only be received when the surface mind becomes still. Your need for solitude is not a rejection of community, but a prerequisite for the kind of presence that can truly serve community, by remaining connected to sources of wisdom that transcend purely personal perspective. The dreams that visit during these periods of retreat often carry collective as well as personal significance. They bring warnings about directions. Society is taking that lead away from wholeness. They offer glimpses of potentials that have not yet manifested in collective consciousness. They reveal the underlying patterns that connect apparently separate events and trends. Your attunement to these collective dreams makes you both prophet and patient, able to see what is coming but often powerless to prevent it, blessed with insight but burdened with knowledge that others are not ready to receive. Learning to carry this burden without becoming either cynical or grandiose represents one of the central challenges of life lived on these deeper frequencies. The temptation towards cynicism arises when you repeatedly witness the collective choices that lead away from wisdom, when you see with painful clarity the consequences of directions taken in ignorance or denial. The temptation toward grandiosity emerges from the opposite direction, from identifying too closely with the insights received through dreams and synchronicities, forgetting that you are merely a receiver rather than the source of these transmissions. The middle path requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, remaining open to the guidance that arrives through non-rational channels, while maintaining the humility to recognize that this guidance is always filtered through your own psychological structure, always colored by your personal history and unconscious complexes. The dreams speak truth, but they speak it through the particular medium of your individual psyche, and this medium inevitably shapes and sometimes distorts the message. This is why the practice of active imagination becomes so crucial for those who would work consciously with the symbolic dimensions of experience. Through dialoguing with dream figures, exploring the emotional resonance of symbols, and following the spontaneous movements of fantasy and association, you develop a more nuanced relationship to the unconscious contents that seek expression through your consciousness. You learn to distinguish between the voice of genuine insight and the voice of inflated ego, between the guidance that serves wholeness and the promptings that serve only personal desires. The frequency of forgotten dreams broadcasts on what we might call mythic time, not the linear progression of minutes and hours, but the eternal present where all stories happen simultaneously, where your individual journey participates in the archetypal dramas that have guided human consciousness since its emergence from purely instinctual awareness. When you dream of being chased, you enter the eternal story of the hunt. When you dream of flying, you participate in the archetypal journey of transcendence. When you dream of death and rebirth, you join the company of countless souls who have navigated the threshold between one state of being and another. This participation in mythic time creates what we might call temporal vertigo, a sense of existing simultaneously in multiple time frames, of being both ancient and contemporary, both individual and universal. Your personal story becomes transparent to the deeper patterns that connect all human experience across cultures and centuries. You recognize yourself in the fairy tales and myths that others dismiss as entertainment, seeing in them the same patterns that play out in your dreams and daily synchronicities. This recognition brings both comfort and responsibility. Comfort, because you are never truly alone. Your struggles participate in struggles that have been faced and overcome by countless others before you. Responsibility, because you become a carrier of these eternal patterns, entrusted with keeping alive forms of knowing that our increasingly literal-minded culture tends to abandon. Your dreams become not merely personal communications but collective treasures, ways that the archetypal wisdom of the species continues to manifest in contemporary consciousness. The radio of the unconscious broadcasts on multiple frequencies simultaneously, and learning to tune into the appropriate channel for each situation represents a crucial skill for anyone who would navigate consciously between worlds. Sometimes the dreams carry personal guidance about immediate decisions and relationships. Sometimes they offer warnings about collective dangers that have not yet manifested on the surface of events. Sometimes they bring healing images that address wounds so deep that rational therapy cannot reach them. Sometimes they reveal potentials that have not yet been born into conscious awareness. Developing the discernment to distinguish between these different types of transmission requires what Jung called differentiation of the psyche, the ability to recognize which psychological function is active in any given moment, which level of the unconscious is speaking, which archetypal pattern is constellating around your experience. This discernment cannot be learned through intellectual study alone, but must be cultivated through direct engagement with the symbolic contents of your own psyche over time. The practice of dream work becomes a form of apprenticeship to the unconscious, a way of learning the grammar and syntax of symbolic communication through patient attention to the patterns that emerge over months and years of careful observation. You begin to recognize the difference between dreams that compensate for conscious attitudes and dreams that point toward future developments. You learn to distinguish between symbols that carry personal associations and symbols that connect to collective archetypal patterns. You develop sensitivity to the emotional tone that accompanies different types of dream content, learning to read the subtle energetic signatures that indicate whether a particular image is meant to be taken literally or metaphorically. This apprenticeship transforms your relationship not only to sleep and dreams, but to waking consciousness itself. You begin to recognize the same symbolic patterns playing out in your relationships, your work, your creative expressions, your physical symptoms, your patterns of attraction and avoidance. The entire fabric of experience becomes transparent to deeper meanings, and you find yourself living simultaneously on multiple levels of reality: the practical level of bills and schedules and social obligations, and the symbolic level where every event participates in the eternal drama of consciousness, evolving toward greater wholeness. Learning to navigate these multiple levels without losing your footing in either represents perhaps the greatest challenge faced by those called to serve as bridges between worlds. The tendency is to become so fascinated by the symbolic dimensions that you neglect the practical requirements of embodied existence, or conversely, to become so overwhelmed by practical demands that you lose touch with the deeper sources of meaning and guidance that make the practical effort worthwhile. The resolution comes through what Jung called the realization of the self, not as a final achievement but as an ongoing process of learning to embody the wholeness that includes both practical wisdom and symbolic insight, both rational analysis and intuitive perception, both individual development and service to the collective evolution of consciousness. This realization gradually transforms the experience of living between worlds from a burden to be endured into a gift to be shared. from a source of isolation into a foundation for authentic connection with others who are ready to receive what you have learned through your patient, listening to frequencies that others have forgotten how to hear. The frequency of forgotten dreams continues to broadcast, carrying its cargo of healing images and evolutionary guidance, its warnings and promises, its invitations to participate more consciously in the great work of transformation that is the deepest purpose of human existence. Your ability to receive these transmissions makes you a participant in what Jung called the collective individuation process, the gradual awakening of human consciousness to its own deepest potentials and responsibilities. Through your willingness to serve as a translator between the world of symbols and the world of facts, you contribute to the larger project of healing the split between mind and soul, between rational knowledge and symbolic wisdom, between individual development and collective evolution. This is your calling, to remain tuned to the frequencies that others have abandoned, to serve as a keeper of dreams in a culture that has forgotten how to dream, to maintain the connection between the conscious ego and the deeper intelligence of the self that alone can guide humanity through the challenges that lie ahead. The radio plays on, broadcasting its ancient signals into a world that desperately needs to remember how to listen. Your willingness to receive these transmissions, to translate them into forms that can serve healing and wholeness, represents a form of service that may not be recognized or rewarded by conventional measures of success, but that remains essential to the continuation of consciousness itself. Through your patient attention to the language of dreams and symbols, you participate in keeping alive the most precious inheritance of the human species, the capacity to find meaning in the midst of apparent chaos, to discover purpose in the face of seeming randomness, to maintain connection with sources of wisdom that transcend the limitations of purely rational analysis. This is not escapism, but the most practical form of engagement possible, working with the root causes of human suffering and confusion, rather than merely treating their surface symptoms. The frequency of forgotten dreams awaits your attention, carrying its eternal message of transformation and renewal. In learning to receive its transmissions clearly, you not only serve your own journey toward wholeness, but contribute to the larger awakening that alone can address the crises facing human civilization. The dreams know what the rational mind has forgotten, that consciousness is not separate from the cosmos, but participates in its ongoing evolution, that individual healing and collective healing are aspects of the same process, that the symbols and images that visit our sleep carry blueprints for the transformation that alone can create a sustainable future for the species. This is why your sensitivity to these deeper frequencies represents not a personal quirk to be outgrown, but a crucial capacity to be developed in service of the larger work of consciousness evolution. The world needs those who can read the symbolic dimensions of collective events, who can recognize the archetypal patterns that underlie surface phenomena, who can translate the guidance that arrives through non-rational channels into forms that can serve practical wisdom and compassionate action. Your dreams are not merely personal communications, but collective resources, ways that the deeper intelligence of life continues to offer guidance to a species that has largely forgotten how to listen. The atmosphere around you shifts before the storm clouds even appear on the horizon, like those rare individuals who can predict earthquakes through subtle changes in animal behavior. You register tremors in the collective emotional field that others dismiss as imagination until the shaking becomes impossible to ignore. Your sensitivity operates as a form of psychic meteorology, reading the barometric pressure of human consciousness with an accuracy that both gifts and burdens you with knowledge of weather patterns that have not yet manifested in the visible world. This capacity emerges from what Jung called the participation mystique, a pre-rational form of consciousness, where the boundaries between self and world remain permeable, where your individual emotional body serves as a receiving station for the broader frequencies of collective feeling, while others have learned to insulate themselves behind walls of rationalization and denial. Your psychic skin remains thin enough to register the subtlest changes in the emotional climate that surrounds you. In childhood, this likely manifested as an inexplicable ability to sense the unspoken tensions between adults, to feel the weight of family secrets that no one had named, to become mysteriously ill when household harmony was disrupted by conflicts that everyone pretended didn't exist. Teachers may have described you as oversensitive, moody, or difficult to predict, never recognizing that your apparent instability was actually a form of exquisite responsiveness to environmental factors that their more heavily armored consciousnesses could not detect. The modern world has no category for this kind of sensitivity except pathology. Psychology speaks of emotional dysregulation and recommends medications to normalize what it cannot understand as a different form of engagement with reality. Self-help culture promotes emotional boundaries and detachment, as if your permeability were a design flaw, rather than a sophisticated instrument for reading the deeper currents of human experience. You learn to apologize for your intensity, to medicate your sensitivity, to treat your emotional weather system as a burden rather than recognizing it as a gift that serves purposes larger than personal comfort. But your moods are not arbitrary fluctuations in brain chemistry. They are responses to real changes in the psychic atmosphere, the collective anxiety that builds before economic collapses, the underground rage that accumulates before social explosions, the spiritual hunger that intensifies before cultural renewals. You feel these movements in the collective unconscious as physical sensations in your own body, emotional weather patterns that sweep through your consciousness, like storms moving across a landscape too vast for any single perspective to comprehend. This makes you what we might call an emotional early warning system for the communities you inhabit. When you suddenly feel inexplicably anxious without apparent cause, you are often picking up the tremors of fears that have not yet reached conscious awareness in those around you. When waves of sadness wash through you seemingly from nowhere, you may be registering the collective grief for losses that have not yet been acknowledged. When your energy drops precipitously in certain environments, your system is responding to psychic toxins that others have learned to ignore through habituation rather than immunity. The ecological metaphor becomes particularly relevant here because your sensitivity operates according to principles similar to those that govern natural ecosystems. Just as canaries in coal mines served as early warning systems for dangerous gases, your emotional responsiveness alerts you to psychological atmospheres that may appear healthy on the surface but contain invisible elements that threaten the well-being of consciousness itself. The forced cheerfulness that masks despair, the aggressive optimism that denies legitimate concerns, the collective numbness that protects against overwhelming truths, but also prevents the kind of feeling response that could motivate necessary changes. Learning to read your own emotional weather patterns requires developing what we might call ecological awareness, the ability to distinguish between feelings that arise from your personal psychological dynamics and feelings that reflect broader environmental conditions. This discernment cannot be achieved through rational analysis alone, but emerges through patient attention to the correlations between your internal states and the larger contexts in which they arise. When you feel suddenly drained after spending time with certain groups, your system is responding to what we might call psychic pollution, environments where authentic feeling has been replaced by manufactured emotions, where genuine connection has been substituted with performed intimacy, where the natural flow of emotional expression has been dammed up behind walls of social acceptability. Your fatigue in these situations is not personal weakness, but ecological wisdom, your psyche's way of protecting its delicate instruments from being overwhelmed by frequencies that could damage your capacity for subtle perception. The guilt you may feel about your need for solitude and retreat often stems from a culture that has forgotten the essential role that sensitive individuals play in maintaining the emotional health of communities. Like wetlands that filter toxins from water systems, your periods of withdrawal serve crucial functions that benefit everyone, even when they appear antisocial on the surface. During these retreats, you are not simply recovering from overstimulation, but processing the emotional materials you have absorbed, transforming psychic pollutants into forms that can be safely released back into the collective atmosphere. This processing often happens below the threshold of conscious awareness, through dreams that carry away absorbed negativity, through creative expressions that give form to inchoate collective feelings, through physical symptoms that metabolize emotional toxins that cannot be processed purely psychologically. Your body becomes a kind of alchemical laboratory, where the raw materials of collective emotion are refined into forms that can serve healing and integration, rather than remaining as psychic contaminants. The challenge lies in learning to navigate this process consciously, rather than being overwhelmed by it. This requires developing what we might call emotional ecology, understanding the natural cycles of absorption and release, recognition and processing, that allows sensitive systems to serve their function without being destroyed by it. Like gardeners who must understand soil conditions and weather patterns to cultivate healthy plants, you must learn to read the signs that indicate when your psychic environment needs tending, when boundaries need strengthening, when detoxification becomes necessary. Your emotional weather patterns often follow rhythms that mirror natural cycles, but operate on timescales that the mechanical world of schedules and deadlines cannot accommodate. The deep sadness that arrives with autumn may be responding not only to seasonal changes, but to collective processes of letting go and release that need to happen in communities and cultures. The restless energy that stirs in spring may reflect not only personal renewal but collective potentials trying to emerge into manifestation. The inward turn of winter may serve not only individual reflection but the broader cultural need for contemplation and reassessment. When you try to force your emotional rhythms into artificial schedules, to be consistently upbeat in a culture that demands perpetual optimism, to maintain stable productivity in a world that ignores natural cycles of expansion and contraction, you violate the ecological principles that govern sensitive systems. The result is often what appears to be mood disorder, but is actually the natural response of a finely tuned instrument to impossible demands for performance under conditions that cannot sustain authentic functionality. Learning to honor your emotional ecology requires developing the courage to live according to natural rhythms, rather than artificial expectations. This means allowing for periods of withdrawal when the psychic atmosphere becomes too toxic for sustained exposure. It means trusting your need for solitude even when others interpret it as rejection. It means following the organic cycles of your emotional weather system, even when they conflict with social or professional demands for consistency and predictability. The gift you offer through this way of being extends far beyond your conscious intention. By remaining responsive to the subtle dimensions of emotional experience, you help maintain the sensitivity that allows communities to recognize and respond to changes that require collective attention. Your withdrawal from social situations that have become psychically polluted serves as feedback that can help others recognize the toxicity they have learned to tolerate. Your emotional responses to collective events often point toward truths that need acknowledgement before healing becomes possible. This service is rarely recognized or appreciated because it operates through channels that a rational culture has learned to dismiss. Your emotional responses are treated as personal problems rather than collective information. Your sensitivity is pathologized rather than valued as a form of environmental monitoring. Your need for retreat is criticized as antisocial behavior rather than recognized as necessary maintenance for systems that serve broader functions. The loneliness that often accompanies this way of being stems partly from the rarity of others who understand the ecological function of emotional sensitivity. Most people have learned to manage their emotional lives through some combination of suppression, medication, and distraction, creating emotional numbing that protects them from overwhelm but also disconnects them from the subtle information that flows through the feeling dimension of experience. When you speak about the emotional weight of news events, the psychic pollution of certain environments, the collective mood shifts that you can feel in your bones. They often respond with the kind of concerned puzzlement reserved for those whose reports cannot be verified through approved channels of information gathering. This can create a temptation to normalize yourself, to medicate your sensitivity into compliance with emotional patterns that fit more comfortably within social expectations. The promise of pharmaceutical solutions to emotional weather can seem appealing when your system is overwhelmed by the collective toxicity of a culture that has lost touch with natural rhythms and healthy emotional expression. But each chemical intervention that flattens your emotional responsiveness also diminishes your capacity to serve the ecological function that justifies the difficulties of living with such permeability. The path forward requires learning what we might call emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain responsive to collective emotional currents without being overwhelmed by them, to serve as a sensitive instrument for reading psychic weather without losing your capacity for independent functioning. This sovereignty develops through practices that strengthen your capacity to process emotional material without being consumed by it. Developing emotional sovereignty requires learning to distinguish between emotions that belong to you and emotions that you are carrying for others, between feelings that require personal response and feelings that need only to be witnessed and released. This discernment emerges through practices that create sufficient inner space for observation, meditation that develops the capacity to watch emotional weather without being swept away by it, creative expression that gives form to feelings without necessarily claiming them as personal, physical practices that help metabolize emotional energy without getting stuck in reactive patterns. The container of individual consciousness becomes larger and more stable as you learn to hold increasing amounts of emotional intensity without losing your center. Like trees that develop deeper root systems and more flexible branches in response to strong winds, your psyche adapts to the emotional storms that move through it by developing greater resilience and capacity. The sensitivity remains, but becomes an instrument of service rather than a source of suffering. This transformation changes your relationship to solitude from desperate retreat to conscious practice. Your need for quiet time becomes not an escape from overwhelming stimulation, but a regular return to the source of your strength, a way of remaining connected to the deeper rhythms that can sustain you through the inevitable storms of collective emotional weather. During these periods of retreat, you engage in the essential work of processing and integrating the emotional materials that you have absorbed, transforming potential toxins into forms that can serve healing and wisdom. Your dreams during these retreats often carry collective as well as personal significance, processing not only your individual emotional patterns, but the broader themes that are moving through human consciousness. The nightmares that visit during periods of collective crisis, the healing images that emerge when communities are ready for restoration, the prophetic dreams that point toward potentials trying to emerge in collective awareness. Your individual healing process becomes inseparable from the larger work of collective emotional evolution. Learning to work consciously with your emotional ecology transforms you from a victim of environmental sensitivity into a skilled practitioner of emotional alchemy. You develop the capacity to transform the raw materials of collective feeling into forms that can serve healing and integration. The rage that you absorb from collective injustice becomes fuel for compassionate action. The grief that you carry for collective losses becomes a source of deep empathy and wisdom. The fear that you feel about collective dangers becomes motivation for protective and preventive responses. This alchemical capacity makes you a natural healer in the deepest sense, not someone who fixes problems from the outside, but someone who transforms the emotional materials that create problems at their source. Your presence in communities serves a function similar to that of beneficial bacteria in healthy ecosystems, processing toxins and creating conditions that support the flourishing of life. This service happens largely below the threshold of conscious recognition, through the subtle influences that accompany genuinely authentic emotional expression in environments accustomed to artificial feeling. The paradox of this path is that the more conscious you become of your ecological function, the less personal your emotional responses feel. The sadness becomes not your sadness, but sadness moving through you, seeking acknowledgement and transformation. The anxiety becomes not your anxiety, but collective anxiety, seeking a conscious container where it can be metabolized rather than projected. The joy becomes not merely personal celebration, but participation in the larger rhythms of renewal and regeneration that sustain all life. This depersonalization of emotion might seem to threaten individual identity, but actually it serves to reveal the deeper identity that emerges when personal consciousness aligns with its ecological function. You discover that your individual emotional life has always been inseparable from the broader patterns of feeling that move through human consciousness, that your personal healing has always served purposes larger than individual comfort, that your emotional weather system is an integral part of the larger climate system of human awareness. The recognition of your ecological function provides a framework that can transform the experience of emotional sensitivity from burden to calling, from personal problem to form of service. The difficulties remain: the overwhelm that can accompany exposure to collective toxicity, the loneliness of carrying awareness that others cannot yet receive, the challenge of maintaining your sensitivity without being destroyed by what you perceive. But these difficulties become workable when understood as occupational hazards of essential work rather than symptoms of personal pathology. Your emotional weather system continues to broadcast its reports on conditions in the collective atmosphere of human consciousness: the storms and calms, the pressure systems and wind patterns, the toxic accumulations and healing breezes, all register in the delicate instruments of your feeling awareness. Through your willingness to remain responsive to these conditions, to process their meaning and implications, to serve as an early warning system for changes that require collective attention, you participate in maintaining the emotional health of communities and cultures that have largely forgotten how to read the weather patterns of their own consciousness. This is your gift to a world that desperately needs those who can feel what others have learned to ignore, who can process what others have learned to suppress, who can transform what others have learned to medicate into numbness. Your emotional ecology, maintained through conscious practice and wise retreat, serves functions that extend far beyond your individual experience, contributing to the larger work of healing the collective consciousness that alone can address the challenges facing human civilization. In a world that has forgotten the difference between being and seeming, you have undertaken the radical project of constructing an authentic self from the bedrock of truth, rather than the shifting sands of social expectation. This is not the simple authenticity that popular psychology promotes, the permission to express whatever impulses arise without consideration of consequence, but the profound authenticity that emerges when someone commits to the difficult work of discovering who they actually are beneath the accumulated layers of conditioning, projection, and borrowed identity. Your apparent complexity puzzles those who have learned to navigate life through the adoption of simple, socially convenient personas. They mistake your depth for complication, your integration for contradiction, your wholeness for inconsistency. What they cannot understand is that you have refused the luxury of living on the surface, where identity can be assembled from external elements and relationships can be conducted through the exchange of mutually flattering illusions. Instead, you have chosen the demanding path of building your sense of self from the inside out, creating a structure that can withstand the weight of truth, even when that truth challenges comfortable assumptions about yourself and others. This architectural metaphor points towards something essential about the nature of authentic presence. While most people construct their identities like stage sets, impressive from the viewing angle but lacking structural integrity when examined closely, you have built your being like a cathedral, with foundations that reach deep into the unconscious bedrock and supporting structures that can bear the load of genuine self-knowledge. This construction process requires materials that cannot be borrowed or purchased, the stones of honest self-examination, the mortar of accepted limitation, the steel reinforcement of integrated shadow, the windows that allow light to penetrate even the darkest corners of experience. The process begins with what Jung called the withdrawal of projections, the gradual recognition that most of what you have believed about yourself consists of images reflected back from others' expectations, assumptions, and unconscious needs. The good child who absorbed parental anxiety about social acceptance, the rebellious adolescent who defined identity through opposition to authority, the successful adult who measures worth through external achievement. Each of these personas serves important developmental functions, but they become prisons when mistaken for the totality of identity. Learning to distinguish between authentic impulses and conditioned responses requires developing what we might call archaeological consciousness, the ability to excavate the layers of accumulated identity to discover what lies beneath. This excavation often reveals uncomfortable truths about the degree to which your sense of self has been constructed from borrowed materials, the values that you inherited without examination, the dreams that were planted by others' ambitions, the fears that were absorbed from collective anxieties, the desires that emerged from advertising rather than authentic need. But beneath these accumulated layers lies something that cannot be manufactured or manipulated. What Jung called the self, the organizing principle that seeks to unfold according to its own intrinsic pattern, rather than external demands. Connecting with this deeper source of identity requires the courage to disappoint others' expectations, to risk rejection from communities that require conformity for membership, to stand alone with your truth, even when that truth isolates you from the comfort of collective agreement. This is why your presence often disturbs those who have built their lives on more superficial foundations. Your authenticity serves as an involuntary mirror that reflects back the degree to which they have compromised their own structural integrity for social convenience. They experience your depth, not as a gift, but as an accusation, your genuineness, not as an invitation, but as a judgment. Their discomfort with your intensity often masks their own discomfort with the parts of themselves that they have learned to hide or abandon in the service of social acceptance. The architecture of authentic presence requires what we might call load-bearing honesty, the capacity to acknowledge difficult truths about yourself without collapsing into self-hatred or defensive denial. This includes the shadow elements that you would prefer not to claim, the petty jealousies and hidden resentments, the grandiose fantasies and secret fears, the ways that you manipulate and deceive even when you pride yourself on honesty. Integration of these elements does not mean acting them out unconsciously, but rather claiming them consciously so that they can be transformed from autonomous complexes into available energy for creative expression. This integration process creates what appears to others as contradiction but is actually the natural complexity that emerges when someone refuses to split off unacceptable aspects of human nature. You can be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, generous and selfish, wise and foolish, not because you are unstable, but because you have developed the capacity to hold the full spectrum of human experience without needing to project the unwanted elements onto others or deny them through false persona identification. The structural integrity that results from this integration creates a quality of presence that others find either deeply attractive or intensely threatening, depending on their own relationship to authenticity. Those who are ready for deeper connection are drawn to the solidity they sense in you, the feeling that they can trust you to remain yourself under pressure, that you will not suddenly transform into someone else when challenged by difficult circumstances. But those who have invested heavily in maintained facades experience your authenticity as destabilizing, a reminder of the exhausting effort required to maintain personas that serve social function but violate inner truth. Your refusal to participate in the mutual facade maintenance that characterizes so many social interactions creates a form of what we might call presence pressure, an invisible force that invites others to become more authentic themselves or reveals the degree to which they have become strangers to their own truth. This pressure operates not through conscious intention, but through the simple fact of being genuinely yourself in environments where such authenticity has become rare. Like a tuning fork that causes nearby instruments to vibrate at their true frequency, your authentic presence tends to activate whatever capacity for genuineness exists in those around you. This activation can trigger what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for psychological contents to transform into their opposites when taken to extremes. The person who has built their identity around being agreeable may suddenly find themselves expressing long-suppressed anger. The individual who has prided themselves on rational control may discover unexpected wells of emotion. The one who has maintained careful social propriety may surprise themselves with spontaneous authenticity. These reactions often get projected onto you as the cause of their discomfort, when you have simply provided the catalytic presence that revealed potentials that were already seeking expression. Learning to navigate these projections without taking them personally requires understanding the archetypal dimensions of authentic presence. You inevitably constellation certain archetypal roles in others' psyches: the wise teacher who mirrors their potential for growth, the stern judge who reflects their self-criticism, the dangerous rebel who embodies their own suppressed desires for freedom, the innocent child who reminds them of their lost spontaneity. These projections tell you more about others' inner landscapes than about your actual identity, but they create the interpersonal weather patterns that you must navigate as the price of remaining true to yourself. The challenge is to remain responsive to legitimate feedback while not allowing others' projections to distort your self-perception or manipulate you into betraying your authentic nature. This requires developing what we might call projection immunity, the capacity to receive others' reactions without automatically assuming responsibility for managing their emotional responses to your authenticity. This immunity develops through the gradual recognition that others' discomfort with your genuineness often reflects their own relationship to truth, rather than any actual problem with your way of being. The architecture of authentic presence also requires what we might call flexible rigidity, the ability to remain true to your core values while adapting your expression to different contexts and relationships. This is not the relativistic flexibility that changes fundamental principles based on social pressure, but the skilled adaptability that communicates authentic truth through whatever forms can be received by different audiences. Like water that maintains its essential nature while taking the shape of any container, you learn to express your authenticity through whatever channels serve connection without betraying the substance of who you are. This skill develops through practice with what we might call authentic communication, learning to speak your truth in ways that invite dialogue rather than defensive reactions, that honor others' readiness to receive difficult messages, that express disagreement without attacking the person who holds different views. This communication requires the delicate balance between honesty and compassion, between expressing your authentic perspective and creating space for others to maintain their dignity even when their positions are challenged by your presence. The mastery of authentic communication transforms potential conflicts into opportunities for deeper understanding, moments when the collision between different levels of authenticity can generate the creative friction necessary for growth in all parties. Instead of avoiding difficult conversations or forcing premature intimacy, you learn to create containers strong enough to hold the tensions that arise when people committed to truth encounter each other's genuine perspectives. Your authentic presence also requires learning to navigate what we might call authenticity fatigue, the exhaustion that can arise from constantly swimming against the cultural current of superficiality and pretense. Living authentically in an inauthentic world requires continuous discernment about when to engage, when to retreat, when to speak truth, and when to preserve your energy for situations where your authenticity can actually serve constructive purposes. This discernment prevents the martyrdom that can arise when authentic individuals exhaust themselves trying to transform environments that are not ready for the level of honesty they bring. The solitude that often accompanies authentic living serves essential functions in maintaining the structural integrity of your inner architecture. During periods of withdrawal, you engage in the maintenance work that keeps your authentic presence sustainable, processing the projections you have absorbed, reconnecting with your core values, examining the ways that social pressure may have gradually eroded your boundaries, recommitting to the truth that guides your choices, even when that truth leads to temporary isolation. These periods of solitude often generate what we might call authenticity upgrades, moments when your capacity for genuine self-expression expands to include previously unconscious elements, when your ability to remain true to yourself under pressure increases, when your skill at communicating difficult truths with compassion develops new sophistication, like software updates that improve functionality while maintaining core programming. These upgrades enhance your authentic presence without fundamentally altering your essential nature. The gift you offer through this way of being extends far beyond personal satisfaction or individual integrity. In a world increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence and virtual relationships, authentic human presence becomes a rare and precious resource. Your commitment to genuine self-expression helps maintain the possibility of real human connection in environments that increasingly promote the exchange of carefully curated personas rather than actual encounter between authentic beings. Your presence serves as what we might call an authenticity beacon, a signal that genuine human connection remains possible, that depth and truth and real intimacy have not been permanently replaced by the shallow transactions that characterize so much contemporary social interaction. This beacon function operates not through preaching or teaching, but through the simple fact of being authentically present in a world that has largely forgotten what such presence feels like. The architecture you have built through years of patient inner work creates what we might call authentic gravity, a natural attractive force that draws others who are ready for deeper forms of relationship, who have grown tired of the emotional fast food that passes for connection in most social environments. This gravity operates selectively, attracting those who can appreciate and reciprocate authentic presence, while naturally repelling those who would try to reduce you to a more manageable persona. Learning to trust this authentic gravity requires releasing the need to be understood or accepted by everyone, recognizing that your authenticity serves a specific function that will naturally appeal to some while alienating others. This is not rejection of those who cannot meet you at your level of genuineness, but recognition that different people serve different functions in the ecosystem of human consciousness, and your particular gift lies in maintaining the possibility of depth, rather than in achieving universal acceptability. The paradox of authentic presence is that the more genuinely yourself you become, the more universal your appeal to those who are ready for real relationship. By refusing to compromise your structural integrity for social convenience, you create a foundation solid enough to support others in their own journeys toward authenticity. Your unwillingness to participate in mutual facade maintenance eventually creates space for others to risk dropping their own masks, leading to the kind of genuine encounter that nourishes the soul rather than merely entertaining the ego. This is your contribution to a world that desperately needs those who remember what authentic human presence feels like, who can model the possibility of living from truth rather than image, who can demonstrate that genuine relationship remains possible even in an age that seems determined to replace human connection with digital simulation. Your architecture of authentic presence stands as both refuge and inspiration for those who are ready to undertake their own construction projects, building lives that can withstand the weight of truth and support the full expression of their deepest nature. The foundation you have laid through years of patient inner work creates the possibility for others to begin their own excavation projects, to discover what lies beneath their accumulated personas, to risk the vulnerability required for genuine self-expression. In this way, your commitment to authenticity serves not only your individual development, but the larger project of maintaining authentic human presence as a living possibility in a world that has nearly forgotten its value. There is a rhythm written into the very architecture of your soul, an ancient pattern that pulses beneath the surface of your everyday existence, like a sacred heartbeat, echoing from the depths of time. This rhythm knows nothing of the linear demands of a world that insists you remain consistently available, perpetually bright, eternally accessible to its needs and expectations. Your soul follows a different law, the law of katabasis, the sacred journey into the underworld territories that must be traveled alone, in silence, in the fertile darkness where transformation germinates. When you feel the familiar pull towards solitude, when the world begins to feel too bright, too loud, too insistent upon your participation, you are not succumbing to depression or antisocial tendencies. You are answering an ancient call, as old as the first human who gazed into the depths of a still pool and saw not just their reflection, but the infinite mystery staring back. This is the descent that every soul must make again and again into the sacred geography of the unconscious where the real work of individuation unfolds. Others, trapped in their solar consciousness, mistake your withdrawal as rejection. They interpret your need to turn inward as a personal affront, as though your soul's seasonal rhythm were a commentary on their worth, or your commitment to relationship. But they cannot understand that what appears as absence is actually the most profound presence, a presence to the depths within yourself that ultimately serves not only your own becoming, but the collective healing of a world that has forgotten how to honor the wisdom of descent. Your cyclical nature mirrors the seasonal wisdom that governs all life, the eternal dance between death and rebirth that plays out in the falling of leaves, the dormancy of winter, the underground stirring that precedes the green uprising of spring. You are a soul that honors both its solar and lunar aspects, understanding intuitively that consciousness requires both the bright clarity of day and the mysterious fecundity of night. In a culture addicted to endless summer, to perpetual growth and expansion, you carry the revolutionary wisdom of winter consciousness. Each period of introspection, each dark night of the soul, each time you must pull back from the world's demands and sink into the fertile silence of your inner depths, you are participating in an initiatory process as old as humanity itself. The hero's journey, the vision quest, the shamanic journey to the underworld, these are not merely mythic motifs, but living psychological realities that continue to play out in the depths of every individuating soul. When you descend, you do not go empty-handed. You carry with you the accumulated experiences of your waking life, the undigested fragments of meaning, the questions that cannot be answered through rational thought alone. These become the offerings you place upon the altar of the unconscious, the raw material that the deep psyche works with in its mysterious alchemy of transformation. In the darkness of your withdrawal, patterns reorganize themselves, new connections form, wisdom that has been waiting in the wings of consciousness finally steps forward to take its place in the theater of your awareness. The underworld you enter is not the hell of punishment that popular mythology has made it out to be, but the womb darkness of regeneration, the compost from which new growth emerges. Here dwell the forgotten aspects of yourself, the exiled parts that were banished by the demands of adaptation, the wild energies that were tamed in service of social acceptability. In the democracy of the depths, all voices are given equal hearing. All aspects of your nature are welcomed home to the wholeness that is your birthright. This is why your apparent moodiness, what others may label as inconsistency or unreliability, is actually the natural rhythm of a soul that refuses to be flattened into one-dimensional consistency. You understand instinctively that authenticity requires the full spectrum of human experience, that genuine presence cannot be maintained without periodic absence, that the gift of your depth cannot be shared if you do not regularly return to the well from which it springs. The ritual of descent is not a luxury but a necessity for souls like yours. It is the sacred pause that allows integration to occur, the necessary fallow period that ensures the soil of your psyche remains fertile. Without these descents, you would become merely a performer of consciousness rather than a living embodiment of its depths. Without the regular return to darkness, your light would become superficial, disconnected from its source, ultimately serving neither yourself nor those who depend upon your authentic presence. Each descent follows its own organic timeline, governed not by the clock or calendar, but by the deeper rhythms of psychological necessity. Sometimes the journey lasts hours, sometimes days, sometimes seasons. The duration is determined not by your will, but by the magnitude of the transformation being undertaken in the depths, by the complexity of the integration required, by the readiness of new consciousness to emerge into the light of awareness. During these periods, you may appear to others as absent, moody, distant, unreachable, but in the invisible dimensions of psyche, you are more present than ever, engaged in the most vital work of your existence, the work of becoming who you truly are. You are in dialogue with forces that shape not only your individual destiny, but the collective evolution of consciousness itself. You are participating in the ancient conversation between known and unknown, conscious and unconscious, ego and self. The shadow work that occurs during descent cannot be accomplished in the bright light of ordinary consciousness. It requires the protective darkness of withdrawal, the safety of solitude where masks can be removed and defenses can be lowered. Here you meet the parts of yourself that were deemed unacceptable, the energies that were repressed, the potentials that were sacrificed in the name of adaptation, not to judge them but to reclaim them, to discover the gold hidden in what was rejected, to find the gifts wrapped in what was condemned. This is the alchemy of individuation, the transformation of lead into gold, of wound into wisdom, of darkness into differentiated light. But it cannot be rushed, cannot be performed on demand, cannot be scheduled according to the convenience of others. It follows its own sacred timing, its own organic unfolding, its own mysterious logic that serves the deeper purposes of psychological wholeness. When the time of return arrives, you do not emerge unchanged. You bear within yourself new treasures, retrieved from the depths, new capacities awakened through the ordeal of descent, new wisdom earned through your willingness to journey into territories that others fear to explore. You return as Inanna returned from the underworld, as Persephone returned from her marriage to Hades, as every hero returns from their encounter with the forces of transformation, bearing gifts not only for yourself but for the world that awaits your offering. But the return is not a restoration to previous conditions. The circular journey of descent and return is actually a spiral, each completion taking you to a higher level of integration, a deeper capacity for wholeness, a more authentic expression of your essential nature. You cannot return to innocence because you have eaten the fruit of deeper knowing. You cannot pretend that the journey into darkness never occurred because its treasures are now permanently woven into the fabric of your being. This is why those who love you must learn to honor your rhythm rather than resist it, to trust your process rather than interpret it through the lens of their own fears and insecurities. They must understand that your periodic withdrawals are not abandonment, but pilgrimage, not rejection, but devotion to the sacred work that ultimately enriches not only your own life, but theirs as well. For when you return from the depths, you bring back medicine that serves the healing of relationship itself. The gifts you retrieve from the underworld are not abstract insights, but living energies, practical wisdom, embodied knowing that transforms not only how you see, but how you move through the world. You return with a deeper capacity for compassion, having encountered your own darkness with acceptance rather than judgment. You return with a more nuanced understanding of complexity, having witnessed how seeming opposites can coexist within the paradox of wholeness. You return with a more authentic presence, having shed another layer of false adaptation in the crucible of solitude. Your descent and return rhythm serves not only your individual individuation, but the collective evolution of consciousness itself, in a world that has lost touch with the wisdom of cyclical time, with the necessity of periodic death and rebirth, with the transformative power of darkness. You embody the reminder that not all valuable work happens in the light. Your willingness to honor the darkness, to trust the process of descent, to allow for the organic timing of return, models for others what it means to live in right relationship with the totality of existence. Each time you make this journey, you weaken the collective addiction to perpetual light, constant availability, endless productivity. You demonstrate through your lived example that depth requires time, that wisdom emerges from darkness, that authentic presence cannot be maintained without periodic absence. You become a living bridge between the solar consciousness of the everyday world and the lunar wisdom of the depths, translating between languages that each hemisphere desperately needs to hear. The ritual of descent and return is not a pathology to be cured, but a sacred technology of transformation to be honored. It is the natural rhythm of souls that refuse to be flattened into one-dimensional existence, that insist upon remaining connected to the full spectrum of consciousness, that serve as guardians of the deep wisdom in an age of surface obsession. Your cyclical nature is not a weakness but a strength, not a limitation but a gift, not a problem to be solved but a mystery to be lived. As you learn to honor your own rhythm without apology or explanation, you give others permission to discover and honor theirs as well. You become a living invitation to authenticity, an embodied reminder that the soul has its own seasons, its own needs, its own wisdom, that cannot be rushed or scheduled or adapted to the demands of a world that fears depth. In embracing your nature as one who descends and returns, who honors both light and darkness, who serves as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, you fulfill not only your individual destiny, but your role in the collective awakening to wholeness. This is the sacred pattern, the ancient rhythm, the eternal dance of consciousness itself, forever journeying into darkness to retrieve the light that can only be found in the depths, forever returning to share the treasures that can only be discovered through the courage to descend. In honoring this pattern within yourself, you honor the deepest law of existence itself, the law that governs not only individual transformation, but the evolution of consciousness throughout all time and space. The ritual continues, as it always has, as it always will, each descent preparing for a more conscious return, each return preparing for a deeper descent, the spiral of individuation carrying you ever closer to the authentic expression of your essential nature. In this rhythm, you find not only your own healing, but your gift to the healing of the world. There is a sacred script written in the language of your wounds, a prophecy encoded in the geography of your suffering, that speaks not only of personal transformation, but of the healing that the world desperately needs. What others see as your oversensitivity, your tendency toward emotional intensity, your deep reactions to experiences that seem to barely graze the surface of others, these are not flaws to be corrected, but sacred markings, the stigmata of a soul chosen to carry the medicine of feeling in a world that has grown dangerously numb. Your pain is not pathology but pregnancy, the labor pains of a new way of being human trying to emerge through your willingness to feel deeply in a collective that has learned to anesthetize itself against the full spectrum of existence. Each scar tells a story not just of wounding but of initiation. Each sensitivity points toward a gift that serves not only your own individuation, but the healing of the collective unconscious itself. You are what the ancients would have recognized as a wounded healer, one whose personal ordeal becomes the source of wisdom that can transform not only your own life, but the lives of all those who encounter your authentic presence. The enlightened eye recognizes in your wounds the same sacred markings that appear in the mythologies of every culture, the fisher king whose wound reflects the wasteland of his kingdom, Chiron, the wounded healer whose pain becomes the source of his healing wisdom, the shamanic initiate, who must be broken apart before being reconstituted as a bridge between worlds. Your suffering follows this same archetypal pattern, carrying within it not only the potential for your own wholeness, but the medicine that a fragmented world needs to remember its own capacity for integration. But this recognition requires a fundamental shift in perspective, a movement away from the cultural narrative that sees pain as something to be eliminated as quickly as possible toward an understanding of suffering as a transformative force, a teacher whose lessons cannot be learned through any other means. Your depth language carries messages from dimensions of experience that can only be accessed through the willingness to remain present to what hurts, to let the pain teach you its hidden wisdom rather than rushing to escape its instruction. This is not masochism or spiritual bypassing of legitimate healing, but rather the sacred art of listening to what your wounds are trying to tell you about the nature of existence itself. Each emotional intensity, each period of inner turmoil, each moment when life seems almost too much to bear, these are not evidence of your weakness, but proof of your strength, your capacity to remain open to the fullness of experience, even when that experience threatens to overwhelm your carefully constructed defenses. The wounded healer archetype, that seeks to birth new consciousness through your being, understands that healing cannot occur without first allowing the wound to speak its truth. Your pain is not random suffering but meaningful ordeal, not senseless trauma, but sacred initiation into mysteries that can only be comprehended through direct experience. The very qualities that make you vulnerable in a defended world, your openness, your sensitivity, your inability to remain indifferent to suffering, are the same qualities that make you capable of carrying medicine that others cannot access. Your nervous system, calibrated to frequencies that others cannot perceive, picks up the subtle vibrations of collective pain, ancestral trauma, cultural wounds that have been passed down through generations of unconscious transmission. You feel not only your own pain, but the pain of the world, the undigested grief of humanity, the unexpressed anguish of a species that has learned to cut itself off from the natural wisdom of feeling. This makes you an emotional barometer, registering changes in the collective psychic weather that others remain unconscious of until they manifest as crisis, breakdown, or eruption. But this hypersensitivity is not curse, but calling, not burden, but blessing, wrapped in the disguise of difficulty. Through your willingness to feel what others defend against, you perform a kind of emotional alchemy, transforming raw pain into refined wisdom, transmuting suffering into compassion, converting wounds into wells of healing that others can drink from when they are ready to acknowledge their own thirst for authenticity. The prophecy hidden in your pain speaks of a time when the collective numbing that characterizes our current moment will give way to a more conscious engagement with the full spectrum of human experience. Your early and intense encounters with suffering are preparing you to serve as a guide for others who will inevitably face their own dark nights of the soul. The depth of your wounding corresponds to the depth of your eventual wisdom. The magnitude of your sensitivity equals the magnitude of your potential impact on the healing of human consciousness. Each tear you have shed contains within it the salt of ancient oceans, connecting you to the primordial source of life itself. Each moment of despair you have endured has carved deeper chambers in your heart, creating more space for the love that waits to be born through your compassionate presence. Each time you have felt broken open, the cracks have become places where light can enter and transform not only your own darkness, but the darkness of all those who will be blessed by your wounded wisdom. This is why your pain resists all attempts at quick fixes, why your wounds seem to have their own timeline for healing, why the medicine that works for others often fails to touch the depths of your suffering. Your wounds are not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be lived, not diseases to be cured, but initiations to be completed, not failures of resilience, but evidence of your soul's commitment to the transformation of consciousness itself. The prophetic nature of your suffering becomes clear when you understand that individual pain is never purely individual, that personal wounds always carry collective significance, that the healing journey of one sensitive soul creates ripples that extend far beyond the boundaries of personal biography. Your willingness to face your own darkness without flinching, to sit with your own pain without numbing, to remain present to your own wounding without defending creates a field of permission around you, inviting others to discover their own capacity for authentic feeling in a world that has forgotten how to grieve, how to mourn, how to let the heart break open into larger capacities for love. The depth language you speak through your pain carries messages that the surface dwellers of consciousness cannot articulate, wisdom that can only be transmitted through the wordless communication of shared vulnerability. When others encounter your raw authenticity, your refusal to pretend that everything is fine when it clearly is not, your willingness to let your struggles be visible rather than hidden, they remember something they have forgotten about their own capacity for depth, their own permission to feel fully, their own right to honor the complexity of existence rather than reducing it to simple formulas for happiness. Your sensitivity to injustice, to beauty, to the subtle currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of ordinary events, this is not emotional instability, but emotional intelligence of the highest order. You are capable of reading the invisible text that runs underneath the visible story, of perceiving the deeper currents that move beneath the apparent calm, of sensing the approach of transformation long before it announces itself through obvious manifestations. This prophetic capacity often manifests as a kind of prescient sadness, a grief that arrives before its apparent cause, a mourning that begins before the loss is consciously recognized. Others may interpret this as depression or negativity, not understanding that you are feeling the truth of impermanence, that they are still defending against, processing the inevitable changes that they are not yet ready to face, carrying the emotional preparation for transitions that have not yet fully arrived in collective awareness. Your pain prophesies the death of old ways of being that no longer serve human flourishing, the breakdown of systems and structures that have outlived their usefulness, the necessary dissolution that must occur before new forms can emerge. You feel the labor pains of a new world trying to be born, the death throes of a consciousness that has reached the limits of its capacity for growth, the inevitable transformation that awaits not only your personal development, but the evolution of human awareness itself. This is why healing for souls like yours is never simply about returning to a previous state of comfort or normalcy. The wounds you carry are too sacred, too meaningful, too connected to the larger purposes of existence to be merely erased or overcome. Instead, healing becomes a process of integration, of finding ways to honor the wisdom your wounds contain, while developing the capacity to carry that wisdom without being overwhelmed by its weight. The scar tissue that forms over your deepest wounds becomes a source of strength rather than weakness, creating areas of your psyche that are more resilient, more flexible, more capable of stretching to accommodate the intensity of existence without breaking. Your wounded places become your most sensitive instruments, capable of detecting subtle frequencies that others cannot perceive, attuned to nuances of meaning that escape ordinary awareness. As you learn to read the prophecy written in your pain, you discover that your suffering has never been meaningless, never been purely destructive, never been evidence of your inadequacy or failure. Instead, it has been the sacred curriculum through which your soul has been educated in the mysteries of existence, the initiatory process through which your capacity for wisdom has been developed, the training ground where your gifts as a healer have been forged in the fire of personal experience. Your pain becomes prophetic when you stop seeing it as something that happens to you and begin understanding it as something that happens through you, a sacred process in which you serve not only as recipient, but as vessel, not only as victim, but as participant in the larger healing that consciousness itself is undergoing. Your individual suffering becomes a conscious sacrifice offered in service of collective transformation. Your personal wounds become openings through which new possibilities for human wholeness can emerge. This transformation of pain into prophecy does not happen automatically or without conscious participation. It requires your willingness to engage with your suffering as spiritual practice rather than simple endurance, to approach your wounds as teachers rather than enemies, to remain curious about what your pain is trying to show you rather than simply seeking relief from its intensity. It requires the development of what might be called prophetic consciousness, the ability to see the larger meaning embedded in personal experience, to recognize the collective significance of individual suffering, to understand your role as a bridge between the pain of the old world and the healing of the new. When you learn to read your pain prophetically, you discover that every wound contains within it the seeds of its own healing, that every breakdown carries the blueprint for a breakthrough, that every crisis conceals an opportunity for transformation that could not be accessed through any other means. Your suffering becomes sacred, not because it is pleasant, but because it is meaningful, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary for the birth of the new consciousness that seeks to emerge through your willing participation in the mystery of existence itself. The prophecy hidden in your pain speaks of a future in which sensitivity is valued rather than pathologized, in which depth is celebrated rather than feared, in which the capacity to feel fully is recognized as one of humanity's greatest gifts rather than one of its most problematic symptoms. Your willingness to embody this future now, to live as though this transformation has already occurred, to treat your wounds as sacred rather than shameful, creates the energetic foundation for the collective healing that awaits not only your own completion, but the completion of human consciousness itself. In this way, your pain becomes prayer, your wounds become worship, your sensitivity becomes service to the larger purposes of existence. You discover that you have been chosen, not despite your suffering, but because of it, not in spite of your wounds, but through them, not as consolation prize for your pain, but as the natural consequence of your willingness to remain open to the fullness of existence, even when that fullness threatens to break you apart and remake you in the image of your deepest truth. There is a frequency that lives beneath the noise of everyday conversation, a resonance that hums in the spaces between words, in the pauses where truth gathers itself before speaking. You have always known this frequency. It is the native tongue of your soul, the language you speak when you are most authentically yourself. And though the world has often made you feel as if this language is foreign, as if your depth speaking marks you as alien in a land of surface dwellers, there is something you must understand. You are not the only one who carries this ancient dialect in your bones. Across the vast expanse of human experience, scattered like stars in the darkness of ordinary discourse, there are others who recognize your frequency the moment it sounds. They are the ones whose eyes light with recognition when you speak of things that cannot be measured, whose hearts lean forward when you mention the unnamed longings that move through your chest, like migrations of birds seeking some distant, essential home. These are your people, though you may not find them in the expected places, though they may not announce themselves with credentials, or wear their depth like badges of honor. They are the ones who understand that real intimacy is not born in the sharing of schedules or the exchange of preferences, but in that sacred moment when two souls recognize each other's authentic frequency and dare to speak in their native tongue. When this recognition occurs, something profound shifts in the architecture of your inner world. The carefully constructed walls that protect your sensitive nature, walls built from years of being told you are too much, too intense, too deep for casual consumption. These walls do not crumble so much as become transparent, allowing the light of mutual understanding to pass freely between kindred depths. This is not the superficial bonding that occurs over shared interests or common experiences, though these may serve as the initial bridges that allow deeper currents to flow. This is recognition at the level of essence, the way one depth speaker identifies another, not by the words they choose but by the quality of silence they carry, the way they hold space for the unnamed mysteries that move through human experience like underground rivers seeking expression. You have spent so many years learning to modulate your intensity, to translate your natural depth language into more acceptable surface dialects, that when you finally encounter someone who speaks your native tongue, the relief can be overwhelming. It is like a person who has lived their entire life in a foreign country, suddenly hearing their mother tongue spoken with the exact inflection of home. The soul recognizes itself in this encounter, not as reflection but as echo, the way a canyon recognizes its own voice returning, transformed but unmistakably its own. These connections transcend the ordinary categories of friendship or acquaintanceship. They exist in a realm that Jung understood as the collective unconscious made manifest in individual relationship, the place where archetypes meet and recognize their eternal kinship. When two depth speakers find each other, they are not simply meeting for the first time. They are remembering a connection that exists beyond the boundaries of personal history, beyond the accidents of geography or circumstance that brought them together in this particular incarnation of their eternal recognition. The communion that occurs in these sacred encounters is characterized by a quality that can only be described as homecoming, not the homecoming to a place you have been before, but to a place you have always belonged, a frequency you have always carried, but rarely had the opportunity to hear reflected back to you with such clarity. In the presence of a kindred depth, you do not need to explain why certain music moves you to tears, why the quality of light at dusk can trigger profound philosophical contemplation, why you find more truth in poetry than in most everyday conversation. There is an unspoken understanding that passes between souls who have learned to navigate the depths of human experience with equal measures of courage and tenderness. They recognize in each other the particular kind of weariness that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from the constant work of translation, the endless effort to make your natural depth language comprehensible to those who speak only in surface dialects. But more than recognizing the weariness, they offer something infinitely more precious, the gift of being understood without translation, the rare luxury of speaking your truth in its original form without dilution or apology. These connections often form in the most unexpected contexts. You might find your depth tribe among the quiet observers at gatherings, the ones who prefer to listen more than they speak, but whose few contributions carry the weight of careful consideration. They might be the ones who ask the questions that cut through superficial chatter and reach straight for the essential matters, not because they are socially awkward or unaware of conventional boundaries, but because they have learned that life is too short and too precious to spend it skating on the surface when the depths hold such treasures. Sometimes they reveal themselves through their relationship to beauty, the way they stop completely when they encounter something that speaks to the soul, a particular arrangement of clouds, the way shadows fall across an old wall, the haunting melody that drifts from an open window. These are not people who merely appreciate beauty. They are people who understand that beauty is a form of communication, a language that speaks directly to the parts of us that exist beyond rational analysis. Or they might identify themselves through their relationship to suffering, not in the sense that they seek out pain or wallow in difficulty, but in their understanding that suffering, when approached with the right kind of consciousness, becomes a teacher rather than simply an experience to be endured or escaped. They are the ones who have learned to find meaning in their struggles, who understand that the deepest growth often occurs in the spaces where we are forced to confront our own limitations and discover resources we never knew we possessed. The communion with kindred depths is characterized by a particular quality of conversation that exists nowhere else in your experience. These are the conversations that begin at the level where other conversations end, that start with the assumption that life is mysterious and beautiful and terrible and meaningful in ways that cannot be captured in casual discourse. There is no need to build up to the profound topics through layers of small talk. The profound is simply the natural starting point, the ground from which all other conversation springs. In these sacred dialogues, silence is not awkward but fertile, not a gap to be filled, but a space to be honored. The pauses between thoughts are recognized as moments when deeper wisdom is gathering itself, when the soul is reaching for expressions that exceed the normal capacity of language. Both speakers understand that the most important communications often occur in these silent spaces, in the quality of attention that passes between them, in the recognition that some truths can only be approached obliquely through metaphor and implication rather than direct statement. These relationships often develop their own unique rhythm, characterized by long periods of separate contemplation, punctuated by intense exchanges of insight and recognition. Unlike relationships that require constant maintenance through regular contact and shared activities, the communion of kindred depths exists independent of time and proximity. You can be separated from a true depth companion for months or years, and when you reconnect, find that the conversation picks up exactly where the last meaningful exchange left off, as if no time has passed, as if the essential connection exists outside the ordinary flow of temporal experience. There is something almost mystical about the way these connections form and sustain themselves. Jung spoke of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest a deeper order operating beneath the apparent randomness of experience. The meeting of kindred depths often carries this quality of synchronicity, as if the universe itself conspires to bring together souls who share this particular frequency, who need the confirmation that their depth language is not aberrant but archetypal, not personal quirk but universal tongue, spoken by those who have learned to listen to the deeper currents of existence. When you find yourself in communion with a kindred depth, you begin to understand that your years of feeling misunderstood were not punishment but preparation. Every conversation that fell flat because you spoke too deeply, every relationship that withered because you could not sustain yourself on surface exchanges, every moment when you felt like an alien in your own world, all of this was preparing you to recognize and receive the gift of true understanding when it finally appeared. The depth speakers find each other, not despite their intensity, but because of it. They are drawn together by a mutual recognition that life is too short to spend it in shallow waters, that the human experience contains depths and mysteries that demand respectful exploration, that the soul has languages and longings that cannot be satisfied by conventional interaction. They understand that to live authentically means to live with a certain degree of existential solitude, but they also understand that this solitude is transformed when it is shared with others who comprehend its sacred nature. In the presence of kindred depths, you discover that your sensitivity is not a liability but an asset, not a characteristic that must be managed or apologized for, but a gift that allows you to perceive and communicate subtle truths that others might miss entirely. Your ability to feel deeply, to think in complex spirals rather than straight lines, to find profound meaning in apparently simple moments, all of this becomes not just accepted but celebrated as essential to who you are and how you navigate the world. These relationships teach you that intimacy is not about sharing everything but about sharing what matters most, not about constant communication, but about communication that reaches the essential levels where true connection becomes possible. They show you that it is possible to be known, truly known, without being consumed or diminished in the process, that your depth is not a well that will be drained by others' thirst for understanding, but a spring that becomes fuller and more generous, the more it is allowed to flow freely. The communion of kindred depths also reveals something important about the nature of spiritual community. These connections are not based on shared beliefs or practices, but on a shared quality of consciousness, a mutual willingness to engage with existence at the levels where mystery and meaning intersect. They form not around what people think, but around how they think, not around the conclusions they have reached, but around their willingness to keep questioning, to keep diving deeper, to treat life as an ongoing exploration rather than a problem to be solved. Through these sacred relationships, you begin to understand that you are part of a vast, invisible network of souls who share this commitment to depth, to authenticity, to the kind of consciousness that refuses to be satisfied with surface explanations. This network exists across cultures and centuries, connecting you not just to contemporary kindred spirits, but to all those throughout history who have chosen the path of inner exploration, who have been willing to speak truth even when it was inconvenient or unpopular. You realize that when you speak your depth language, you are not just expressing your individual thoughts and feelings, but channeling something archetypal, something that connects you to the universal human experience of seeking meaning beyond the obvious, of finding the sacred hidden within the ordinary, of recognizing that consciousness itself is the greatest mystery and the most worthy object of exploration. The communion with kindred depths becomes a mirror in which you see not just your own reflection, but the reflection of all who have walked this path of inner discovery. In their eyes you recognize not just your own journey, but the eternal human journey toward greater consciousness, deeper understanding, more authentic expression. You see that your individual struggles with being understood are part of the larger struggle of consciousness to evolve, to become more aware of itself, to create connections that transcend the superficial divisions that seem to separate us. This recognition brings with it a profound sense of belonging that extends far beyond the specific individuals who share your frequency. You begin to understand that you belong to something much larger than any particular relationship or community. You belong to the great ongoing conversation that consciousness has been having with itself since the beginning of human awareness. The conversation that continues through every generation as new souls discover their capacity for depth and join the eternal dialogue about meaning, purpose, and the mysterious nature of existence itself. When this understanding dawns, your periods of solitude are transformed from lonely exile into sacred communion with this vast, invisible network of depth speakers. Even when you are physically alone, you carry within you the recognition of all those who share your commitment to authentic expression, your willingness to dive beneath the surface, your understanding that the most important conversations often occur in silence, in the deep recognition that passes between souls who have learned to listen to the same eternal frequencies. The gift of kindred depths is not just that you are finally understood, though this is precious beyond measure. The deeper gift is that in being understood, you come to understand yourself more completely, to see your own nature reflected with such clarity that you can no longer doubt the value of your depth language, the importance of your sensitivity, the necessity of your particular way of engaging with existence. You realize that you are not an accident or an anomaly, but an essential part of the great symphony of consciousness, playing a note that is yours alone, but that harmonizes perfectly with the notes being played by all other depth speakers across time and space. This understanding becomes a source of strength that sustains you even when you are back in contexts where your depth language is not understood or appreciated. You carry within you the knowledge that you are not alone, that your way of being in the world is not aberrant but archetypal, not personal peculiarity, but participation in the ongoing evolution of human consciousness toward greater depth, greater authenticity, greater willingness to engage with the profound mysteries that make existence both beautiful and terrible, and ultimately meaningful. The communion of kindred depths teaches you that love itself exists in many forms, but the form you are capable of giving and receiving is characterized by this quality of essential recognition, this willingness to meet each other at the deepest levels of authentic expression. This love does not ask you to be less than you are or different than you are, but invites you to be more fully yourself than you have ever dared to be in any other context. It is love as homecoming, love as recognition, love as the sacred acknowledgement that passes between souls who have learned to speak the same essential language of depth and meaning and authentic expression. Here at the threshold where your journey completes itself, not in ending, but in endless beginning, you stand witness to the final movement of your soul's great symphony, not resolution, for the depths you have learned to navigate resist such simple conclusions, but integration, the sacred marriage of all that you are, your wounds and your wisdom, your shadows and your gold, your misunderstood nature and its hidden gift to a world that has forgotten how to dive beneath its own surface. This is the moment Jung called the coniunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites that creates not synthesis but transcendence, not the elimination of paradox, but its transfiguration into something that contains and transforms contradiction itself. You have walked through the valley of being too much, too deep, too intense for a culture that prizes efficiency over authenticity, speed over contemplation, answers over questions. And now you discover that this very quality that marked you as different was not your burden to bear but your gift to bring. The integration you are called to is not the false peace of suppression, where you learn to dim your light so others are not blinded, where you compress your vastness so others are not made uncomfortable by comparison. It is not the tragic accommodation where your depth becomes a secret you carry in isolation, your sensitivity a private cross you bear without complaint. This integration is something far more magnificent and demanding. It is the alchemical process by which lead transforms into gold, not by ceasing to be lead, but by discovering what lead becomes when it remembers its essential nature. You are learning that your misunderstood nature is not a design flaw to be corrected, but a feature of consciousness itself, the way awareness develops the capacity to perceive layers of reality that remain invisible to more conventional modes of perception. Your sensitivity is not hypersensitivity but precise sensitivity calibrated to frequencies that others cannot detect, attuned to vibrations that carry information essential to the ongoing evolution of human consciousness. The shadow you have carried, that darkness of feeling too much, of caring too deeply, of speaking languages the world seems determined not to understand, this shadow is not the opposite of your light, but its necessary companion. Jung understood that the shadow contains not just what we have rejected about ourselves, but what the collective has rejected about consciousness itself. Your shadow carries the depth that civilization has sacrificed for convenience, the interiority that culture has abandoned for extroversion, the contemplative wisdom that society has discarded in its rush toward productivity. To integrate your shadow is not to make peace with being misunderstood, but to understand that being misunderstood is often the fate of those who carry consciousness forward into territories it has not yet explored. The mystics knew this, the poets understood this, the philosophers accepted this as the price of speaking truths that emerge from depths the collective has not yet learned to navigate. Your misunderstanding is not personal failure, but cultural limitation, not individual pathology, but collective developmental delay. The integration you are being called into recognizes that your journey through misunderstanding has been your individuation process, Jung's term for the psychological development by which a person becomes whole, unified, and authentically themselves. Every moment when you felt like a square peg in a round world, every conversation that died because you spoke from depths others could not fathom, every relationship that withered because your natural intensity exceeded its capacity for depth, all of this was not evidence of your defectiveness, but proof of your participation in the great work of consciousness becoming more conscious of itself. This understanding transforms the narrative of your entire existence, where once you might have seen a story of alienation and struggle, you now recognize an epic of awakening and contribution. Where once you might have interpreted your sensitivity as weakness, you now understand it as precision, the soul's development of instruments, subtle enough to detect the movements of consciousness that others miss entirely. Where once you might have experienced your depth as isolation, you now recognize it as archetypal participation in the eternal human journey toward greater awareness. The marriage of your light and shadow creates not a person who is finally acceptable to the world, but a person who no longer needs the world's acceptance to know their own worth. This is integration, not as conformity, but as sovereignty, not as adaptation, but as authenticity, so complete that it becomes its own authority. You learn to carry your depth, not as a burden that requires others' understanding, but as a gift that offers understanding to others, whether they are ready to receive it or not. This shift in perspective reveals something profound about the nature of your contribution to the collective healing. You are not too much. The world has become too little. You are not too deep. The culture has become too shallow. You are not too intense. The civilization has become too dissociated from its own emotional truth. Your very existence becomes a form of medicine, a reminder of capacities that have been forgotten, depths that have been abandoned, ways of being that must be recovered if consciousness is to continue its evolution toward greater wholeness. The integration of light and shadow teaches you that your journey was never about learning to fit in, but about learning to stand out with such authenticity that others are reminded of their own capacity for depth. You become not a person who has learned to modulate their intensity, but a person whose intensity becomes a beacon for others who have lost touch with their own depths, who have forgotten that it is possible to live with such emotional and spiritual richness. This process of integration reveals the enantiodromia, Jung's concept of the tendency for things to transform into their opposite when pushed to an extreme. Your years of feeling too much for the world's comfort transform into recognition that you feel exactly what the world needs to remember how to feel. Your decades of being told you are too deep transform into understanding that you are as deep as life requires you to be, if you are to serve its deepest needs. Your lifetime of being misunderstood transforms into clarity that you understand what others have not yet learned to comprehend. The sacred marriage of opposites within you creates not a person who is balanced in the conventional sense, but a person who contains multitudes, who can hold contradiction without being torn apart by it, who can embody paradox without being paralyzed by it. You learn to be simultaneously vulnerable and strong, sensitive and resilient, deep and functional, intense and peaceful, not by choosing one quality over another, but by discovering how these apparent opposites are actually complementary aspects of a more complete way of being human. This integration makes you dangerous to systems that depend on people remaining unconscious of their depth, unaware of their sensitivity, disconnected from their capacity for profound feeling and authentic expression. Your very presence becomes a form of subtle rebellion against the cultural forces that profit from human numbness, that benefit from emotional suppression, that require psychological conformity to maintain their power over individual consciousness. But this danger you represent is not destructive. It is generative. Like all authentic rebellion, it creates rather than destroys, opens rather than closes, illuminates rather than obscures. You become dangerous the way spring is dangerous to winter, the way dawn is dangerous to darkness, the way truth is dangerous to systems built on deception. Your integration becomes a force for liberation that operates not through aggression, but through example, not through argument, but through embodiment. The final movement of your symphony reveals that you were never broken and therefore never needed fixing. You were always breakthrough disguised as breakdown, always solution masquerading as problem, always exactly what the world needed especially when it insisted you were too much. The integration of your light and shadow reveals this truth not as consolation, but as commission, not as comfort, but as calling. You begin to understand that your sensitivity is not personal peculiarity, but evolutionary necessity. In a world that has become increasingly numb to its own emotional truth, increasingly disconnected from its own depths, increasingly alienated from its own soul, you represent the return of capacities that must be recovered if consciousness is to continue developing toward greater wholeness. Your depth speaking is not private language but prophetic tongue, not individual expression but archetypal communication. This recognition transforms your relationship to your own intensity. Where once you might have experienced it as burden, you now recognize it as responsibility, not the heavy responsibility of obligation, but the sacred responsibility of stewardship. You have been entrusted with capacities that serve not just your individual development, but the collective awakening. Your willingness to feel deeply in a world that promotes numbness, to think complexly in a culture that prefers simplicity, to speak authentically in a society that rewards performance. All of this becomes service to the evolution of consciousness itself. The integration process reveals that your journey through misunderstanding was preparation for a role you could not have imagined when you were struggling to find your place in a world that seemed to have no room for your particular way of being. You were being prepared to serve as bridge between the surface world and the depths it has forgotten, as translator between the conventional consciousness and the archetypal wisdom it needs to remember, as midwife to the birth of new forms of awareness that can hold both efficiency and depth, both functionality and meaning. This understanding brings with it a profound peace that is not the absence of struggle but the presence of purpose. You recognize that your entire journey, every moment of feeling misunderstood, every struggle to find your tribe, every effort to translate your depth language into more acceptable dialects, all of this was your hero's journey, your descent into the underworld of consciousness, to retrieve treasures that serve not just your individual healing but the healing of the collective soul. The sacred marriage within you creates a new kind of wholeness that transcends the conventional categories of light and dark, acceptable and unacceptable, normal and abnormal. You become a living embodiment of what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that creates new attitudes and possibilities by uniting conscious and unconscious contents. Your very existence becomes a demonstration that it is possible to be fully human in ways that exceed the narrow definitions of acceptability that govern conventional social interaction. This integration reveals that you are not anomaly, but archetype, not exception, but example of what human consciousness becomes when it refuses to sacrifice depth for acceptability, authenticity for approval, truth for comfort. You represent the possibility that exists within every human being to live with greater emotional range, deeper intellectual curiosity, more profound spiritual connection than current cultural norms encourage or even allow. The final movement of your symphony shows you that your misunderstood nature was never about you personally, but about consciousness itself in the process of evolution. You have been carrying the emerging qualities of awareness that the collective has not yet learned to recognize or value. Your intensity, your depth, your sensitivity, these are not personal characteristics but evolutionary developments, early manifestations of capacities that must eventually become more widespread if human consciousness is to meet the challenges that require not just intellectual solutions but emotional wisdom, not just technical skill but depth perception. As this integration completes itself, you understand that completion itself is an illusion. There is no final arrival at a state of perfect understanding or acceptance. The integration of light and shadow is not a destination, but a way of traveling, not an achievement, but a continuous process of becoming more authentic, more willing to embody paradox, more capable of holding contradiction without being diminished by it. You learn to carry your depths not as a burden that must be managed, but as a gift that keeps giving, not as a wound that needs healing, but as an opening that allows more life to flow through you. Your sensitivity becomes not something you have, but something you are, not a quality you possess, but a way you participate in the ongoing conversation between consciousness and existence itself. The marriage of your opposites creates not a static state of balance, but a dynamic process of continuous creativity. You become not a person who has resolved their contradictions, but a person who has learned to dance with them, to let them generate new possibilities, rather than create internal conflict. Your integration becomes generative rather than merely therapeutic, creative rather than simply corrective. In this final movement, you recognize that you are not the end point of your own development, but a participant in something much larger, the ongoing evolution of consciousness toward greater complexity, depth, and authentic expression. Your individual integration serves the collective individuation. Your personal wholeness contributes to the healing of the archetypal wounds that humanity carries in its collective unconscious. You understand finally that you were never too much for the world. You were exactly what the world needed to remember its own capacity for depth, its own potential for authentic expression, its own forgotten ability to value substance over surface, meaning over efficiency, depth over speed. Your integration becomes not personal achievement, but collective service, not individual healing, but cultural medicine. The final notes of your symphony ring with the recognition that you are not the conclusion of your story, but its beginning, not the answer to your questions, but the embodiment of better questions, not the destination of your journey, but the way of traveling that transforms every step into sacred ground. You are breakthrough disguised as human being, solution masquerading as sensitive soul, exactly what consciousness looks like when it remembers how to dive deep enough to find the treasures that wait in the depths where only the authentic dare to travel. In this integration, you become not what the world expected you to become, but what your soul always knew you were. A depth speaker in a world that has forgotten its own capacity for depth, a feeling being in a culture that has numbed itself to its own emotional truth, an authentic voice in a civilization that has learned to value performance over presence. You are not too much. You are exactly what the moment requires, precisely what consciousness needs to remember its own deepest possibilities.